Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this live session. And this afternoon, we'd like to look at another interesting topic: Black leaders and slave reparations. What about African complicity? So, we're going to be looking at this very controversial topic because we need more clarity, we need more transparency, we need more scholarly work on this very important topic, which we're not getting a lot from our universities. Now, before we begin tonight's discussion or this afternoon's discussion, I want to establish an important historical point. When we talk about slavery, race, Africans, Europeans, and reparations, we often project today's racial categories backward into a world in which people did not necessarily understand themselves in the same racial terms that we use today. The modern concepts of black and white as broad racial categories did not simply exist from the beginning of human history, and we need to understand that. They were constructed and increasingly consolidated during the era of European colonial expansion and the Atlantic slave trade, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries. Before the modern racial system hardened, people commonly identified themselves and others through ethnicity, nationality, language, religion, kingdom, political allegiance, geography, and culture. An Englishman was an Englishman. A Portuguese man or Portuguese person was Portuguese. An Akan person was Akan. A Yoruba person was Yoruba. A Congo person was Congo. A Wolof person was Wolof. These distinctions mattered. But as European colonialism and the Atlantic slave system expanded, Europeans increasingly began organizing human beings into broader racial categories. And these racial categories became connected to power, social status, labor, slavery, and eventually theories of racial hierarchy. That brings us to the difficult question we are examining tonight or this afternoon. Black leaders and slave reparations. What about African complicity? There is no question that some African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries participated in the capture and sale of enslaved people to European leaders. But we need to ask a series of questions and uncomfortable questions. If African societies participated in the slave trade, what exactly was their role? Did that participation make Africans collectively responsible for the Atlantic slave system? Does it diminish the responsibility of European states, merchants, plantation owners, financial institutions, and colonial powers that developed and profited from slavery on an enormous scale? And perhaps most importantly, how should the actions of particular African rulers and merchants centuries ago affect the modern reparations debate? We cannot have an honest conversation about reparations by telling only one side of the story, but neither can we take the actions of particular African societies and use them to erase the enormous role played by European powers in creating, expanding, regulating, and profiting from the Atlantic slave system. This afternoon, we're going to examine the history from multiple angles: African participation, European involvement, the construction of racial categories, the economics of slavery, and the modern demand for reparations. And I want this conversation to challenge everybody because we're going to talk about history. We need the whole history, not just the parts that make us comfortable. So the question that we need to really reflect on this afternoon: if we're going to demand accountability for slavery, who exactly should be held accountable and for what? So let's begin the discussion this afternoon. Now, we're going to look at a small clipping here because I want to say that many of us think that white, black came, was always throughout the world. But these concepts were really new concepts, contemporary concepts that people don't understand. And there's much illiteracy in the Caribbean and in the world at large about slavery, because we think that what we learned in school is the whole story. But that is not the entire story. And that is what we'd like to look at in this afternoon's program. So let me just give you a clipping here of this Black person explaining to us what it is really about. Slavery was the elites, right? They're the ones who actually concocted the term so that they can divide the human race while they are winning the game.
Africans sold Africans like it's some kind of historical gotcha. It's a lazy argument that only works if you ignore how the world actually functioned 300 years ago. You're looking at a map of a continent and seeing one giant monolithic group of people. Why? Because you're looking through the lens of the American social construct of race. You see black people selling black people, but in 1750, there was no black identity in West Africa. There were nations, empires, kingdoms. People were Ashanti, they were Dahomey, they were Oyo, they were Fonte. When the kingdom of Dahomey went to war with a neighbor and sold the captives to a European ship, they weren't selling their own. They were selling enemies, foreigners, prisoners of war. We don't look at the Napoleonic Wars and ask why Europeans were killing Europeans. We understand they were different countries with different flags. Why don't we grant Africa that same geopolitical reality? And let's be clear about the sale. These kings weren't signing up for the American version of chattel slavery. They didn't have a concept of industrial, generational, you are now subhuman property slavery. In their world, a captive could often earn freedom or marry into a family. They thought they were trading prisoners. They didn't know they were feeding a machine that would erase a person's humanity for 4 centuries. By the time they realized the scale, it was a trap. The coastal traders and pirates flooded the region with firearms. It became the gun slave cycle. If your neighbor has guns and you don't, you're the one getting on the ship. You either traded captives for firearms to defend your borders, or your entire nation ceased to exist. It wasn't a racial betrayal. It was a brutal global arms race where the currency was human life. Stop simplifying a tragedy just because you don't want to learn the history.
Okay, so as the professor here, not professor, but the person in the video just explained, the racial categories of black and white that we take for granted today were constructed in the 18th century. Before that period, people were much more commonly identified according to ethnicity, nationality, kingdom, language, religion, and culture. That distinction is critical to this afternoon's discussion, because when we look backward at the history of slavery, we have to be careful not to impose today's racial categories on people who understood their identities differently. So when we ask, what about African complicity? We're not talking about some monolithic category called Black people. We're talking about particular African societies, rulers, merchants, and intermediaries who participated in a historical system that was becoming increasingly racialized. And that brings us to the central question this afternoon. If we are going to discuss responsibility and reparations for slavery, are we prepared to examine the entire system, including African participation, as honestly as we examine European participation? And there was an article written by this person, and he was talking about Henry Louis Gates. And if you, those of you who know, you know that he was, if not a former professor at Harvard University, was actually an African American. Now, when you hear the word slavery, do you immediately think of race, or do you think of an economic and political system? And I would ask you why. Now, did you know that African rulers and merchants played a significant role in supplying enslaved people to European leaders? Does African participation in the slave trade reduce European responsibility? No. Or are these two separate questions? They can coexist. If an African ruler sold captives to European traders, who bears the responsibility for what happened to those captives afterward? Then that is what we're looking at. Now, there is a source here which suggests here that we have traces of, reparations and African complicity in the slave trade. And James DeWolf Perry is a regular contributor. He appears in Traces of the Trade and is director of research for the Tracing Center on Histories and Legacies of Slavery. This commentary is cross-posted for James' own, writing. So Professor Henry Louis Skip Gates Jr. has an op-ed in his morning's New York Times in which he takes on the issue of reparations for slavery. Gates will no doubt attract enough controversy for his general approach to the issue. He is convinced that our society must address the issue of reparations and that we must reach a just and lasting agreement, which he believes will have to be a judicious, if symbolic, gesture to match such a sustained, heinous crime. Remarks like this will land any public intellectual in the US in hot water these days. Just consider the case of Goodwin Liu, whose mild remarks related to reparations at one of our events in 2008 became a central issue in his nomination by President Obama for a seat on the Ninth Circuit. However, this essay is most notable for telling difficult truths about the central role of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade and thus about the shared culpability of people of different races in the resulting history of slavery. What is unusual about the essay is not that the historical facts which Gates relates about Africa's role in the slave trade or even the interpretation which gives them. These are commonplace observations in the study of the slave trade and are necessary to the most basic understanding of that historical phenomenon and its legacy today. So this is what they're saying now. When I address audiences on the history of legacy of slavery, I will often say that slavery and the slave trade were never about race. Having offered that hopefully surprising statement, I will explain that while the concept of race gradually became important in justifying and perpetuating slavery in the United States, race played essentially no part in establishing the transatlantic slave trade or in bringing millions of Africans to the Americas. Now, this is quite controversial, and we're going to be looking at the pros and the cons and look at all of the arguments so that we can come up with our understanding. Now, this argument has two parts. First, the Europeans and Americans did not engage in the slave trade out of any sense that it was particularly appropriate to enslave Black people. Okay. And second, that Africans were full partners in the slave trade without any sense on their part either that race was relevant to what they were doing. In the same way that we are being sold out here in the Caribbean to all corporations, that's the same thing. So they were not just selling Jamaicans or Barbadians or Trinidadians. They're looking at class, and this is a symbol of money, right? And money and power. Gates addresses the second part of this argument, summing up by saying that white people and Black people on both sides of the Atlantic were complicit alike in one of the greatest evils in the history of civilization. Now, when we visited slave forts along the African coast in modern-day Ghana to film traces of the trade, we were walking in the footsteps of my ancestors, James DeWolf and the other members of the DeWolf family, who purchased more than 12,000 Africans in such slave forts. As Gates asked, how did slaves make it to these coastal forts? The reality is that nearly all who were sent across the Atlantic in chains were enslaved by Africans. Gates cites two leading historians of the slave trade, John Thornton and Linda Haywood of Boston University, for the proposition that roughly 90% of the slaves sent across the passage were were enslaved by African traders and then sold to Europeans along the coast. Other leading scholars believe that the percentage is actually much higher, that only at the margins were any Africans enslaved directly by Europeans. The leading role of Africans in the slave trade was a necessary one. The slave trade took place before Europeans colonized the continent of Africa, and white traders exercised little influence beyond their coastal trading posts. Only African countries or societies could extract slaves from the interior of the continent, primarily by taking captives in wars or kidnapping in raids. The vital role of Africans in the slave trade made for highly profitable business for many African societies, as we're seeing happening right here in the Caribbean, right in our modern times, lining the pockets of the local rulers and of the many ordinary people who became involved in the trade. As Professor Gates notes, slaves were the primary export of many kingdoms in Western and Central Africa, including the Asante in Ghana, Dahomey in Benin, and Nongo in Angola, and Congo in the modern Congo. Now, these facts dispel the myths of the fact that Africans were only tangentially involved in the slave trade, or that African societies were coerced into participation, or that slave trade left a legacy of demographic or economic harm to those societies which participated in it. Another myth which I often hear is that Africans participating in the slave trade had no idea what slavery meant in the Americas. The implication is that they were less culpable because they assumed slavery would be far more benign for the victims than it actually was. Gates outlines the historical evidence against this myth too, noting that many African elites, including ambassadors and the children of African royalty, actually visited the Americas and even did so on slave ships. So we had the elites and their children and the ambassadors on slave ships. So they knew what was the plight of the people whom they sold into slavery. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans would occasionally be freed and return to their homes in Africa, while later on thousands of freed slaves returned to settle in Liberia and Sierra Leone. As Gates puts it, under these circumstances, and I quote here, under these circumstances, it is difficult to claim that Africans were ignorant or innocent, unquote. And this is a quotation from Henry Louis Gates. Now, I said above that what is noteworthy about this essay isn't the history that Gates recounts, but that someone of his stature is telling the truth and putting it front and center in the discussion about reparations for slavery. Those of us who are descended from the wolf slave traders and who speak out in traces of the trade about the dominant role of the northern United States in slavery and the slave trade are generally quite well received by those who want to push forward the dialogue about reparations or the legacy of slavery generally. In other words, those who care about the issue tend to embrace the message that the complicity of white Americans in slavery and the slave trade was broader and deeper than has been generally acknowledged. That this complicity extended to the northern states and to most ordinary citizens. Most people who are in conversation about the legacy of slavery in the United States are, however, deeply reluctant to acknowledge the role of Africans in the slave trade as Gates describes it. Now, look at what he's saying. Excuses run the gamut from Africans didn't know how harsh slavery in America was, and slavery in Africa was by comparison humane, or in a bizarre version of the devil made me do it. And Africans like to say that the devil made me do it. Africans were driven to this only by the unprecedented profits offered by greedy European countries. And this is the same thing that we see our political elites and economic elites doing right here in the Caribbean. Nothing new under the sun. Now, why is this? One problem for many African Americans in particular, and Caribbean people too, is that it is always difficult to acknowledge that one's own people were complicit in wrongdoing. We see this again and again in our work as people freely acknowledge the horrors of the de-wolf slave trade, but are reluctant to embrace the truth that their own northern ancestors were probably involved in the slave trade as well. Or people embrace this truth but reject that their own ancestors were complicit in slavery as well, whether because they had settled in the Northwest or the West during slavery, or came to this country as immigrants following the end of slavery in 1865. Another reason why many Black activists and their white and non-white allies are often reluctant to acknowledge the African role in the slave trade is that this reality explodes the myth that the enslavement of Africans occurred because of racism. Okay, it was not only based on racism. While history amply demonstrates that this belief is false, the myth lives on because it is a convenient way of understanding the past and of explaining the truth that the burden of these historical events and their legacy has fallen to Black people to bear. Likewise, it is convenient to believe that the blame for slavery can be allotted on the basis of race. This mythology not only allows for the demonization of white people historically, but it provides ammunition for claims of reparations for slavery. Now, the argument for reparations is generally framed as a claim that Black people continue to bear considerable disadvantages as a result of slavery, and that is true, and that white people are responsible for correcting the situation. The first part of the argument is hard to refuse, that Black people is bearing and continue to bear a disproportionate disadvantages as a result of slavery. But the second part is much more problematic. Why should those who played no part in the history of slavery be held accountable for it? The easy answer, but one which is historically false, is to claim that it was white people perpetrated slavery and must now be held accountable for it. Now, can we be that simplistic as people who think that we have a nuanced brain? There are other ways to make the claim or the case for reparations, which is how Gates can emphasize this history and still suggest that reparations is an issue that cannot simply be dismissed. One approach, for instance, is to point out that white people today still disproportionately enjoy the benefits of the history of slavery, which we cannot deny. Another response would be that society as a whole and not white people per se are responsible for correcting an historic injustice perpetrated by this society. A final reason why many people are profoundly reluctant to talk about the African role in slavery is that this history is commonly abused by those who would shut off all discussions of the history and legacy of slavery in our society. Because as I've been saying on this channel, we tend to argue to the extreme right or to the extreme left, and there is no middle ground in terms of looking at nuances. And we are doing our children a great disservice for doing that, because we are not going to have any true intellectuals. I will refer to these people here as conservatives for simplicity, although I'm talking specifically about those who, regardless of their politics in other respects, argue that the history of slavery no longer has any effect on our society and that we should simply stop talking about it, because that is not what we should do. We have to talk about it, but we have to speak the truth. Their reasoning is simple. If African societies participated in the slave trade, then there is no reason to hold our society accountable for its own role. If Black people participated in the slave trade, then there is no reason for white people to pay attention to this history today. This, of course, is a misuse of history. The fact that various societies and people of various races participated in the slave trade says nothing about who must grapple with this history and its legacy today. Indeed, most people would reject out of hand, okay, the notion that one person, group, or nation may avoid dealing with a historical legacy because others have inherited that legacy as well or have not yet owned up to their own inheritance. In fact, however, many African leaders and nations have been addressing their historical responsibility for the slave trade in recent years, acknowledging responsibility and asking for forgiveness. Now, why must we openly acknowledge and engage this history, despite the risk that by doing so rather, it will be difficult that others may seize on these facts for their own purposes? Well, on one level, this is a strategic issue. As long as we do not include the complicity of Africans in how we tell the story of slavery and the slave trade, those who would silence this conversation can continue to play gotcha by unveiling that aspect of the history as it were a dramatic surprise and unexpected argument which undermines the entire discussion. More broadly, I believe firmly that the starting point for addressing an historical legacy must be to tell the truth and the entire truth at that. When we talk about lies, and we talk about even Jason or Day, we don't realize how much lies we get learning at school. The school system is a big lie. And oftentimes, the scientific knowledge is not given in the entire truth. The historic knowledge is not given in the entire truth. The religious knowledge is not given in the entire truth. And that is what we're here to do on this channel, to unveil what is truth, though the heavens fall. Now, in the case of slavery in particular, we have long suffered in the US from a collective national amnesia about certain key aspects of this history. The same thing in the Caribbean. The path to a comprehensive national dialogue, to healing in whatever form, and to moving forward together must lie in encouraging the telling of the whole truth. Deliberately obscuring inconvenient aspects of this truth will only hinder this effort and those who would keep other important facts buried forever. We also need to learn important truths about human nature from the long, terrible history of Atlantic slavery, because human nature is evil, okay? Human nature is not nice. In particular, why have we chosen to enslave others so often in our history? How is it that we are able to do so and to justify what we do ourselves? We can't explore these questions if we aren't open and honest about who participated in slavery as well as how and why they did so. I've also suggested that we have dramatically overstated the role of race in the history of slavery, as well as in our response to this history today. In the end, race did play a vital role in the history. We can't deny that. Circumstances conspired to bring about a situation in which the free citizens of our society were primarily of one race, while those who were enslaved were primarily of another race. This fact, in turn, led to profound racial inequalities in contemporary society and to the development of ideas about race which retain a tight grip on our thinking even today. It is this last aspect, however, which explains why we have in some ways overstated the role of race in slavery and in our response to it today. I'm convinced that in order to move forward together, we need to both acknowledge the role which race has played and continues to play in our society, and also to confront the limitations of race as a way to think about ourselves and our society. Because this is something that we have to look at, is something that we must acknowledge, because what we're seeing in the world today is this both camps, moral people and immoral people. And we need to know that our human nature is not necessarily, for good. It's more for evil and for bad. The more money we have is the more money that we want. The more power that we have is the more, power that we want. Whether you're black, white, Chinese, Jews, that is how human nature is essentially that. Now, there was another piece that was written by a Ghanaian. His name is Yaku Shaw Taylor. And this is very important. I'm going to just summarize the pieces that he has mentioned in this very beautiful piece. Now, Yakushaw's article, and Yakushaw Taylor is a Ghanaian writer and researcher whose work explores African history, slavery, colonialism, and historical memory. So, drawing partly on his own experience growing up in Ghana, he challenges both colonial distortions of African history and the tendency to overlook African participation in the slave trade. Now, Yakushaw Taylor's article, Incomplete Memories, Distorted Histories, The Loud Silence About Africa's Complicity in the Slave Trade, argues that the history of the transatlantic slave trade has often been told incompletely in parts of post-colonial Africa, particularly in Ghana and other West African educational contexts. Drawing on his own experience growing up in Ghana and on the research of scholar Ella Karen Shaw Taylor, argues that the African school textbooks historically devoted relatively little attention to the transatlantic slave trade and even less to domestic slavery within African societies. Where African participation in the Atlantic trade was acknowledged, it was sometimes described vaguely as the actions of some Africans, few chiefs, or particular individuals, while Europeans were presented as the principal driving force. The author connects this selective memory to the understandable post-colonial effort to restore African dignity and the challenge European colonial stereotypes of African inferiority. After independence, African historians and intellectuals had strong reasons to emphasize African civilization, resistance, and achievement. Shaw Taylor argues, however, that this corrective project sometimes created another distortion. Uncomfortable aspects of Africa's own history were pushed aside because they appeared to undermine the effort to reclaim a positive African identity. A major theme of the article is therefore the tension between defending Africa against racist European representations and confronting Africa's own historical involvement in systems of slavery. Importantly, the article does not argue that African participation makes Europeans and Africans equally responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. Rather, Shaw Taylor calls for a more complicated history, one that recognizes European demand, commercial power, and organization, while also acknowledging the African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries who participated in the capture and sale of enslaved people. The article ultimately calls for the truth-telling rather than selective memory, which we do have in his history. Shaw Taylor argues that acknowledging African involvement in slavery does not require accepting racist stereotypes about Africans, just as condemning European colonialism does not require pretending that Africans had no agency or responsibility. His central conclusion is truth-telling about African slavery and liberation from European cultural stereotypes can never be mutually exclusive. So the first point he's making here, the silence around slavery. The history of West Africa's slave trading past seemed forbidden. Shaw Taylor recalls attending high school only about 5 miles from Cape Coast Castle, yet receiving little discussion of the slave trade. The author's point, the physical evidence was everywhere, but the history was largely absent from his education. And this is in Ghana, this is on the African continent. Now, point number 2, African textbooks minimized the Atlantic trade. Shaw Taylor cites Ella Caron's analysis of West African textbooks. The Atlantic slave trade occupies up to 5% of the books. He adds that secondary school textbooks sometimes tended either to disregard totally the subject or contained little information about the transatlantic slave trade, which we have here also in the Caribbean. That is a point that we should be raising here. Now, the point number 3, domestic slavery was even more neglected. So slavery on the African continent is not so much spoken about. There is no discussion about the domestic slave trade. Caron's research found that textbooks frequently overlooked slavery within African societies while focusing heavily on European involvement. Now, this leads me to the key question. Why separate the history of African slavery from the history of the Atlantic slave trade? We need to do a comparative study. Now, point number 4, who were the African participants? According to the article, textbooks often attributed African participation to foreigners, particular individuals, or undefined states. Shaw Taylor says African participants remained the obscure few chiefs and or some Africans. His criticism, such language obscures African agency and responsibility. And in the Caribbean here too, we don't want to accept responsibility. Everything is, what is happening in the Middle East because of the war, because of everything, that is almost like we have no agency at all in the region, but to be as slave mongers as the Africans and Europeans were and are. Now, point number 5, Europeans as the driving force. The author cites the review of Ghana's new textbooks. Europeans are still depicted as the driving force, only aided by Africans. And there is no discussion of the widespread internal slave trade. So this is one of the article's strongest claims and one worth putting directly on the screen. Now, point number 6, why was the history suppressed? Shaw Taylor argues that after independence, African intellectuals were engaged in vindicating the past and liberating African historical consciousness from European stereotypes. He argues that this necessary effort to restore African dignity sometimes made it difficult to confront the darker aspects of pre-colonial history. Now, which leads to the question, can a people reclaim their dignity without idealizing their past? And we do that here in the Caribbean. We like to idealize our past rather than looking at the full history, even that which is extremely painful. Now, point number 7, the Pan-African Project. The article argues any discussion of the pre-colonial African involvement in the slave trade were topics incompatible with the Pan-African Project and the search for a glorious past. We're all looking for a glorious past in which our people were these saint-like, wonderful, holier-than-thou people. Now, Shaw Taylor uses the 1945 Pan-African Congress as an example of how anti-colonial political priorities overshadowed questions surrounding African involvement in slavery. Now, point number 8, the castles were not simply heritage. Shaw Taylor quotes the Ghana Museums and Monuments Board. The castles and forts of Ghana constitute treasures par excellence. That's what they're saying. He strongly objects to this language because these sites were also places where enslaved people were imprisoned. His response, there is nothing excellent about sites that were holding pens for captured human beings. But no, they have to do this for the tourist industry because people are going to come there and they're going to make this look, more fanciful than it really is. Now, this is a powerful slide for our understanding of slavery. Now, point number 9. Shared responsibility does not mean equal responsibility. Now, the article's argument should be presented, very, very carefully, as we're saying here. It does not mean Africans were responsible for the slave trade, just as we're saying Europeans were. Rather, Shaw Taylor argues that the history must recognize African participants or African participation alongside European responsibility. He writes, and he says here, Africans, and I quote, cannot remove themselves from the moral responsibility they shared with the Europeans. And point number 10, truth telling and liberation, because that's the only way we can liberate ourselves, when we know the full truth and nothing but the truth, even though the truth might be a painful one. Could this necessary and understandable project of contesting exaggerated and unfavorable images of Africa have been done while also admitting that the culture was broken? People, we come from broken cultures, whether we like it or not. We come from broken cultures with broken systems where rich people, wealthy people, elites of this world want to control us, but in so doing, they have to disunite the human population. But we are not their friends, by the way, whether you're white or you're black. They will try to use one and weaponize one race against the other or one nationality against the other, but they don't like any of us. Truth-telling about African slavery and liberation from European cultural stereotypes can never be mutually exclusive. Now, truth-telling about African slavery and liberation from European cultural stereotypes should never, and I repeat that, and can never be mutually exclusive. And that is what we need to understand as we begin to look carefully at this very, very sad history of our human race. Now, let us look at some other clippings here before we get into the discussion of what is happening. Let's look at some other presentations by other people who are chiming into the conversation, because this is all about education and not about the literacy, which is so large in the Black world as far as we're concerned. And that's why we're going to go right back into slavery, because we don't know the truth. We don't want to hear the truth. And then when we are living darkness, because we're going right back into the dark ages, then is when you will understand that much of what you think you know was not the truth. All right, so that is what we are here to defend: the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Was a black man. Yep, we're gonna get into it. But before we get into it, welcome back, class, to Night History School, where we go over the unfiltered truth of history, history that is usually covered up or just not touched at all. But here we're gonna dive into it. We're gonna call roll, but instead of calling all of these names as our classroom grow, I just want y'all to show me you are present by liking this video, following my page, and commenting just to let me know you were here. Also, the rules I have is no texting, no talking on the phone. I need you paying attention. My second rule is take you a little drink. And I see my white class in here. Y'all looking a little too happy about this one. Woo! Black people in my class, they look like they won't fight me in the back. But it's all right. The truth is hard. It's hard, y'all. And we can't argue that history is being taken out of class in schools if when real history comes at you, you don't want to hear it. You cannot make history convenient for you. All right? Let's get into it. So in 1621, a African black man came into America by way of Virginia to be an indentured servant. Yes, he was not a slave, he was an indentured servant. At that time, slavery was not around yet in America. It was all indentured servants, which was completely different than slavery. This was very popular among Africans as well as Europeans coming to the country. At that time, indentured servants would typically have a set amount of years that they would have to work underneath their owner or master, which typically was about 5 to 7 years. A lot of people that were in servitude came from a few different things. Mainly, it could have been that they owed a debt to someone. They were captured and sold into servitude, or they had committed a crime. So Johnson, he served his time as an indentured servant. He finished his time, and right when he finished his indentured servitude, he had enough money to start purchasing land. By 1651, he had already amassed 250 acres of land. He also had become one of the wealthiest free black men in the colony, and he owned probably about 15 slaves, I would say. It says he owned about 6 to 7 African slaves, and the other half was white. He was very wealthy, and things took a turn. It took a turn in in 1653, where one of Johnson's African servants by the name of John Kasser or Kaser claimed that his term of service was over, and he left to work for another white neighbor. Johnson sued that white neighbor and demanded that Kaser be returned. He brought this to the Virginia court, and it took 2 years for the Virginia court to make this settlement. But in 1655, they ruled in Johnson's favor, and they declared Kaser a slave for life. And this was the first legal time ever in American history where it was someone being a slave for life. And it changed the courtroom drastically, y'all, and it changed American history. And this didn't happen by a white slave master, it happened by a black man. And I want to continue to tell you that he was African. He was not a black or a Negro American that was already here. And over time after that case, the court started making laws against Africans owning slaves, owning land, because at that time in the colonies, an African could become free. He can purchase land. He can even own a firearm at that time. But all of those laws changed, and then slavery started now to solely depend on race or a color of skin. And this was the first time that it started happening in America, because this was not the United States yet. Okay? But ironically, he passed away in 1670, and the Virginia government ended up seizing all of his land, y'all. And they declared that he was an alien because he was an African. Yep.
Okay,
You
so we
saw
will
that
stop.
into a lot of
We
stuff
can't
today.
we can't exhaust.
And ending this
So
video,
we
I just
can't
want to
exhaust
say
this
that a
video.
lot of
But what
your
is very clear
first
that he's suggesting is that black people were involved in the slave trade. In as much as we're seeing here what is happening with our world and the injustices and the capture of our land and everything, our resources in the Caribbean, that our politicians and our economic elites within our borders are also complicit. But it's very difficult for people to make connections, and that's one of the reasons why we have to have these critical discourses, because we're not hearing this sort of analyses in our school system and also in the mainstream and independent media. People take one side and they run with it, or the other side and they run with it, and they think that is the point and that is the issue. Let's get to some of your comments. Marie saying it was perhaps based on the Hebrew bloodline as opposed to the Hamite bloodline as in Deuteronomy 28, but I admit that those are controversial issues. Well, yeah, for one of the things that we must understand too, that people can move in and out of elites. People can move into elite families. Look at Meghan Markle, right? Who is married now into the British royal family. She is what? A Black American, right? So the fact of the matter is that people have always done that. And we know that our politicians, some of them, and our economic elites, some of them are coming from lower classes, and they move up into that sort of class and they perpetrate it. So when we're looking at people from just a color perspective and not looking at systems of power, knowing that people can benefit no matter what color they are, and they can behave similar to what you think is the oppressive class, then you're not thinking. So we have now to move away from this simplistic understanding of slavery and what blackness and what whiteness is all about. Because you can have black people who are also more white than the whites who actually you think are whites. Okay, now let's look at this clipping of a video, which is so correct, of this Pan-African guy. He's not supporting my point, but he's making a crucial point here that you need to understand, that black people can work against their own people, all right, which they often do because they're elites.
Was a better house nigger, the white man would be more merciful to him. So when we saw them planning to kill Gaddafi, we all looked at, without mixing my words, Mugabe was there, Zuma was there, Museveni was there, Kagame was there. They all knew. And when they tried to rush into Libya, they were told by the Western NATO, stay away. We are going to get rid of him. Go and find the interview by Museveni himself admitting that we looked away. We were there and we were told to look away, and we looked away. Why? Because you thought that it's Libya. You thought that it was Saddam Hussein. You thought it was Vietnam. You thought it was Syria. You thought it was Afghanistan. And what happens in Afghanistan will not happen to us. Lo and behold, one by one, we have seen the colonial hand plague. And by the way, sometimes I get very, very controversial, not for the sake of being controversial, but for being truthful. See, the West should never lie to Africans that our governments are illegitimate and they are corrupt, when they are the very same people who are involved in putting those people into power. What hypocrisy is?
Yeah.
You come around with regime changes. You change the regime. Then you want to run on the public media and say the government is corrupt. They were educated by you. They were trained by you. They were sponsored by you. Mugabe had more than 40 PhDs from British universities, American universities. They all recognized him and clapped hands. And they want to come around and say, this African leader. No, Mugabe was not African. Mugabe was Sir Mugabe, with palaces given to him by the Queen in Coventry.
Until
he touched land, he became a relegate. So are we saying that you are only a good president as long as you are playing the tune of the colonial system? The answer is yes.
So that's the whole point. And he's making a crucial point here, that your own people that you regard as black or colored or Indian or whatever you regard, whatever your ethnic group is, can work against you. Notice what he also said. Today you might think it's Trinidad and Tobago, but tomorrow it might be Jamaica. I remember when Miss Kamala Persson-Bissessar was aiding and abetting the United States administration with getting Maduro out. When I was doing the videos on it, Jamaicans were saying, well, we need to stay out of that because it's not our business. How can it not be your business if a country that proposes no threat to the United States, right? If the president is going to be sacked with the complicity of a neighboring country like Trinidad and Tobago, and it's not none of your business, okay, well, what happens when Jamaica has to do the bidding of the United States in getting Cuba? Do we see how things are connected? And we have to connect our histories, and we have to connect the history to what is happening now. So you don't believe that when Miss Kamala Persson-Bissessar and Andrew Holness and all of these prime ministers are connected to the global elites and their agenda, they're not working on your behalf. And if slavery should be presented to them tomorrow to sell citizens from these countries in slavery, they will do it. They will do it, even though you said that you voted for them. And that is what we have to understand. So there is no difference from that perspective, understanding that Africans were involved in the trade, the elites, merchants, the political class, yes, would have been involved because it was a system of getting money, profitable system, and we are not living in a different era. The only difference is we think we're free, but soon we are going to understand that we are not free. We think we're free. We think that's how we're in an enlightened age, but it is not true. That is what you think. And very soon you're going to realize that you're on the plantation without anything. Now, Marie saying here again, it is sad that the Africans who were complicit were Hamites, not Hebrews. Yes, and what we have to think too is that Israelites can send their old people to. Don't look at people and think of freedom in terms of group. Right? Yes, sometimes as a group, we have to fight for some things, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, nobody in the group is going to look out for your best interest, right? No white people, no black people, no Israel people. If you go to Israel today, many of the Israelis and the Jews are not agree with what Israel is doing because they understand that their agenda does not align with the people, the ordinary Jews who live in Israel. So when we think, oh, it's the Jews or it's the Israelis and all of that stuff, you have to be more nuanced in your understanding. We do not live in this world as a group. Even your church group, there are people in your church who are hypocrites, and they will kill you at any given moment. So you have to understand that even though we identify in groups, so you say that you're Trinidadian, you say that you're Tobagonian, you say that you're Guyanese, you're Jamaican, but it does mean therefore that your fellow national patriot is going to defend you and your cause, or that you share the same values. And that's what we tend to we reason like that, and then we're disappointed to know that our same compatriot decides to unite with the enemy against us. And that is how we think. And we have to get out of that rotten idea that because somebody looks like me, right, and they are connected to me, that they're necessarily my friends, they could be my enemies. How many times have we heard about family members killing each other anyway? So we need to get out of that. Now, we have Marie Antoinette saying, although both groups were black. As we said, people did not identify themselves as black in the sense of how we do that. Back in the days, people look at their ethnic groups and they talked about the Irish race. They talk about the Nigerian race. They talked about the Ghanaian race. They did not look at themselves as black and whites. They talked about the British race. So people were not in that sort of thing. It was the Europeans now who developed. Looking at the Bible, they were saying, let us misuse the symbol of what whiteness is, and whiteness stood for righteousness and black stood for evil. And they decided that they would misuse those symbols in the Bible and say that black people who were brown, nobody's really black or white, because whites are not whites too. We're different shades of brown. Let's make that very clear here. Biology does not endorse any race. Right? We are just different shades. We come in different shades from very light brown to dark brown. So at best, we are dark brown, and some are lighter than we are. So everybody's brown because we all came from the earth. That was where we came from. And every time we go to funerals, they say ashes to ashes and dust to dust, because human is nothing but dust. Okay? So let's be clear on that. But the fact of the matter is, the Europeans created that sort of, reality. Right now, they're using even the Bible to substantiate and to defend their sexual revolution. So the Bible and holy text can be used and misused, and that is what they did during slavery, and they conditioned many people, and that's why the slave could not read the Bible. Of the books they could not read, because they understood that if the slaves understood what the Bible says, the whole system would have come down. Now, it's a more complicated scenario than it appears. Absolutely. It is more nuanced. Greetings, Brother Jamat. Hello, everyone. And that is from Alexis. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Let's go through what you're saying. Now, we have support for all Africans and African descent people discussing the slavery issue as we move forward in reparations. Well, we're not going to get into reparations. That's the whole point of this dialogue here. The people who are defending us getting reparations are people who are connected to the system. I repeat that. The people who are at the forefront of trying to get African peoples to get reparations are people who are connected to the system of oppression. Okay, so you are not going to get any reparations. What they're doing, they're using these people because they look like you and you think they are defending your interests. And then at the end of the day, you're going to realize that they're about to enslave you. Okay, and not to really give you any reparations and to elevate your standard of economic, prosperity. Okay, that is the whole point of this live. Is not necessary to just tell you about African being involved or not. It's for us to learn the lessons of yesteryear and to connect the dots and be able to see if we can synthesize and understand that we're living in the same era. We're not necessarily the same in terms of the same realities, but we can learn from the past. We have not learned from it, so we are going to repeat it, which means, therefore, that the repetition of slavery is going to happen because our minds are dark and we take one side. Nobody wants to look at both sides of the argument or the three sides or the fourth. They want to remain in their dark understanding of what they think the history is. Remember that history is his story. So you have to read many aspects and different narratives so that you can come up with your own understanding of what the truth is, which many of us don't want to hear. Now, then we go to the next point here. West Africans must face questions that must come out of the Caribbean. Now, it's not the West Africans per se. Again, we need to understand the common man in Africa was not involved in slavery. The common West African, the common African citizen, Nigerian, Ghanaian were not involved in slavery. Okay? The effects of slavery they might have, to grapple with. Okay? In the same way, the common European was not involved in slavery, but they would have also benefited because of the fact that the society was sort of divided. And because the colonial masters and the elites didn't want white working class to unite with the black working classes, because they know that if the two were united, that they would overthrow the entire system, they decided to give some of these white people the benefits that they're accruing. But it's not because they like them. It's because they don't want them to unite with other with their fellow humans and then attack the system to destroy it. That is the point. All right, so it's not us versus them. It's us versus them in the sense that it is us, the working class, or the middle class of the world, the humans of the world, because they're not humans. They don't regard themselves as humans. They think that they are supernatural beings. These elites. That's why they come from bloodline families, and they call themselves the elites. Okay, because they don't see you on common ground as they. Obama doesn't see you on common ground as he. You could be as black as jet. He doesn't think that you and he are equal. Okay, so let's go. West Indians must face, we go into another point here, because right now the same tribes that sold slaves are West Africa's current ruling class, correct? And that's the whole thing. But in the Caribbean also, we are not different, because the same class that governed us under colonialism, they left the same system intact in which our politicians and our economic elites have inherited, and they continue with the same system. The system hasn't changed. The system has remained intact. Okay, the system is here still, only that very soon you are going to see where the laws are going to be fully eradicated and slavery will be once more. Right, the history of Anthony. Yes, thank you so much for joining. Angola, yes, and we're getting some interesting comments coming from you. They don't deserve reparations. Okay, well, some people do deserve reparations, and we can understand reparations in the sense of land reparation. Right now, as we said, many people are losing their lands because they are telling us that, oh, you didn't own the land in the first place. So we do need some form of reparations, land reparations. Remember now that whites got reparations. Let's make that very clear, that the planters got reparations. The white people in the southern United United States, they got reparations through their mule and the acre of land that they got in the South. So white people did get reparations. Okay, so we deserve it, but not in the sense that they're telling us, because there are some individuals like politicians and or economic elites who should not get any reparations because they continue to benefit from the system, and they too have extracted wealth from us, the people here in the Caribbean and also in Africa. So please be very noticeable of that. When we say reparations, who deserves and who doesn't? And that is why we have to have an open and transparent conversation. We can't just follow what they're telling us. We've got to dig deeper into the history to understand the many different narratives that are out there. But our people are too asleep. They're asleep and they don't want to hear because they love to be in darkness. Now, why you mentioned black and white when it was economics, have or have nots? Yes, I mentioned that because even though that is so, but you can't negate the fact that that is what people say about people. Now, look at the word gay. The word gay did not mean sexual orientation years ago. It meant to be happy, right? But now you have to acknowledge the fact that that word has also, evolved. So the same thing with white and black. Before in history, that reality never existed, but they have created such a reality that we still cannot ignore that it exists. We can tell people that historically that wasn't the case, but until the whole reality of black and white is eradicated from our society, which I don't think it will, we have to use those terms, right? But it's not that it's true. Remember now that perception is not reality, but it can be perceived as reality, as many people think it is. The planters lost property, but they got money. Right? That's what we're saying. We had to give them money. They got money from free labor. So the planters lost their plantation, but they were compensated, which they shouldn't have because the slaves were working for them free of cost. Okay? And that's the whole point. You're not following the conversation properly. Right, that is what you have to follow the conversation, Pedro. We're not saying here that people should not look carefully and critically at. Let me see what Pedro is saying. Yeah, I ain't following properly if people are complicit. Who to blame? Yes. So that's what we're here having, Pedro. We're saying that the people who are actually defending reparations are the people who have inherited the whole oppressive system that is killing us right now in the Caribbean and the world. So if they are actually trying to get compensation and they get it in their hands, they're not going to give it to you because they live in a system that they continue to oppress us. And they're not changing the system. They don't want to change the system because they benefit from the system. So if you're going to give Bill Gates, let us say Bill Gates was black, right? And you're going to give Bill Gates trillions of dollars to pay out reparations. Do you think he'll be paying out any reparations? No, because he benefits from the system. And that's what we're saying. So all of these Mia Motleys and these people who are benefiting, Andrew Holness and all of these prime ministers will not give you a dime, okay? Because they are a part of the global system, okay? Grow up, you weren't in slavery. You are in slavery, right? You're in Barbados, you are in slavery. You are under the strictures of the international, the Monetary Fund, the IMF, all right? So you are in slavery. Don't believe that you are out of slavery. What do you own in Barbados? Absolutely nothing. Okay? Absolutely nothing. Same thing in Jamaica. We are in slavery because you own not even the land that you live on, you own. Okay? Your ancestors sold you, so get over it. Yeah, and if you don't learn the lessons of the past, then you are not going to be free, and that is what you probably want, Pedro Jamal. But I want to be free, and I want, most importantly, your mind. Even if you're not physically free, but your mind is the thing that should be free, right? And if you don't understand the issues, then you could look like you're free, but you're still enslaved. Okay, so we have that. Enjoy being a slave. Well, yeah, you should. You should, because you don't want to get out of that narrow understanding of continue to say that who benefited. Of course, we're not saying we are trying to understand who benefited, but we're looking at the whole system and say that it is not individual or group. We have to look at the system and systems of power, who inherited what. I mentioned the whole matter of the fact that you don't have to be born to have born in as an elite, but you can graduate into that class. And I mentioned even Meghan Markle, who came out of an ordinary Black American, and she found her way into the British royal family. Okay, all right. And whatever you want to say of her, she represents that family. And you don't tell me about who is who and their, because the British royal family we know is dysfunctional. But the fact of the matter, if she were to represent anybody, she's not going to represent Black race. All right, she's representing herself and the royal family. Don't look at their squabbles and their divisions, because at the end of the day, she's going to side with them, not you, even though she looks like you. Okay, and that is what we are saying in our conversation today about race and the participation of our Black people. But our people are so narrow in their concept of understanding what this is about. It's not about here to cast blame on anyone, but we are trying to look carefully at the system. Now, did Africans participate in the system? And there is some clipping. Let us just get some more clippings before and get some more understanding. And this is Joy. I'm trying to give you as many discussion points as I can.
But they forget those people were destroyed. As Michael Harriot said when we had him on for our Black History special, if Black people were selling other Black people, why did you need a fort? If this was a transaction that was mutual and the kings of Africa were just selling off Black, well, then why did you need to build giant forts? You build giant forts because you were having wars with those kings who you were stealing their people. You wouldn't need a fort if you were selling and buying.
And that's something that people that's the information that gets passed out a lot. Your people sold.
They love to throw that out there. Take the burden
people,
off them.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Because the history gets distorted that way, and it minimizes. And I've always been a person, and I know they trash me on online, but I want to know what is the connection point? Because you said it. Once that happened, it cut the connection. I literally physically saw it when you said that, almost like a cord being is there ever going to be a connection point between African immigrants and Black Americans?
It's already
happening now.
Yeah.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
If you go to Ghana right now, you will see African Americans on every street. They're getting their residency, they're getting their citizenship, they're moving back, they're reinvesting. Africans, we reconnected the umbilical cord ourselves, and that's why you always talk about why people are mad. The 1619 Project was one of those moments where Black people said, no. We're going to recreate our own history. We're going to tell our own story. And that story does not mean that we come from slavery. We don't come from slavery. You all come from oppressing. You guys come from robbery and theft, and you need to own that. But we are starting to tell our own story and reconnect ourselves to Africa and really invest in Africa and realize there's a huge bounty of human capacity, of financial capacity, and that together we're like the most powerful weapon on earth.
Yeah, I feel that energy. I've done 9 countries. I want to go to more countries in Africa. I want to do all 54.
Same.
I want to be able to go to Madagascar and say I met somebody from Madagascar. But what I
and bring back a wife for your friends.
but what I love is there is this similarity and this connection through all of the countries I've been to in Africa. There is this connection that I feel the same being here, growing up in America, and I'm I just want to see and minimize or eradicate the confusion that is the distrust or the pointing fingers at each other. Well, you guys are this way, or you look down, or you think you're better. You're an African booty scratcher.
Well, how do you think they stole us?
Yeah.
I mean, their method was to say, hey, tribe number 1, sell me somebody from tribe number 2, or give me your prisoners of war from that tribe. Remember, these people didn't think of themselves as all Black. You're this tribe, I'm that tribe. If I have prisoners of war from the other tribe, okay, I'm going to go ahead and let them go to you. And then they got greedy and said, it's not enough for me to give you your prisoners of war. I'm going to go back and just take people, right? But it did start out as, I'll take my prisoners of war. They didn't think it was going to be endemic slavery forever. Right. And then once they got greedy and were come and taking people, then there were the fights. But even in the Caribbean, there are a lot of African Americans who think of Caribbean Blacks as foreign. They're probably your cousins. If you're in New Orleans, you're probably Haitian. You know, I mean, if you're in Florida, you are probably from Barbados because you probably have first cousins in Barbados. You know, they would drop people off in the Caribbean and then sell them to South Carolina. Like the route was often Caribbean, then the U.S.
That's where they would break slaves usually.
They would break them in the
Break
Caribbean,
them, yeah.
100%, and then bring them here. So
Yeah.
it's like a lot of people, their first stop was not Virginia or South Carolina. It was Jamaica.
Yeah, it's crazy. Damn.
Well,
You know, remember on
we could go on.
but
and
we
on.
still here though.
And we still and survive.
And I can feel it, Burgeon. I can feel it connecting. You got Gabon. You got Ludacris lives in Gabon. He has a place in Gabon.
Yeah.
Yep.
Citizen in Gabon. So it's coming around.
It's coming.
They're
That's why we have
they're
this. That's why we
counting.
have
They're-
154.
That's why they're
That's it.
panicking and they're counting on our not being together like we got, because we're all we got. Dr. Henry Clark says we have no friends in the world. Black people don't have friends. He meant that. Dr. Henry Clark, one of the elders who knows his stuff, we don't have them, regardless of what you think in the whole scope of the world. Our power. There's a girl online, this white chick, who she has this machine where she asks questions to the machine. She goes, why is it that, black people are always like oppressed, blah, 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 and the machine talks back to her and goes, because of black people's power, is their melanin, is they're native to the, that's the reason why whites try to shut, it's like a machine. Just white go ask these questions about oppression, and it's really good stuff.
You guys send me that video.
I'm gonna send it to you. It's really
I haven't seen
interesting. And she goes, it's because it's not just, it's not just, it's just black people. It's their power. It's their natural. It's dope. It's like amazing. She just asked these questions.
It's like when you have a connection to indigeneity, it's actually a powerful thing. It's why when you go and talk to Native Americans, they have a power, they have a spiritual power because they have a connection to the soil and the spirit.
Yeah.
And that is an African thing. There's a connection to the earth, the soil, and the spirit. And if you can reconnect yourself with that, Europeans worked very hard to disconnect themselves from that. And to eradicate that from what they considered to be high society and being, what they saw as being civilized.
Yes.
But being civilized meant just cutting yourself off from indigeneity. And so, which is what you're seeing, like people who are from Europe that go to Israel try to reclaim, right, and steal back. But what black people have is sort of a natural indigeneity. Like we're just naturally indigenous people. The food we eat, the rhythm, the dancing, the music, the gospel.
It just comes out.
We just took it. Like we take, spiritual songs and music and turn it into gospel. A thing that's a spiritual, physical experience. And it's just that's an indigenous vibe. And so that vibration is common to everyone black, whether you're in East Africa, West Africa, Caribbean, Brazil. All we need is to try to get over some of the phony, false separation that Europeans actually used to steal us. And it was a tactic to steal us. And as long as we fight infighting, they can keep stealing us. And so that's how we have to learn.
I want the infighting to stop. Like
that has to stop.
The last thing you want is to turn around and it's the people who look.
Okay, I think that's enough. One of the things that we have to, and I'm trying to see how we can discuss this, is the whole we. Now, is the Black Barbadian equivalent to the Black Jamaican or the Black Trinidadian? In some ways, yes, but in many ways, no. And we have to understand that. And the Black Barbadian is going to be more loyal to the Black Barbadian interest than to a Black Jamaican, and vice versa. Right? The same thing with African Americans, and that's why we have a lot of Caribbean wars and wars among African Americans and Africans, because we all think we are the same. And yes, we had a similar experience of slavery, right, in the Caribbean and in North America, but culturally we are different. And we must understand that people are going to link themselves according to their culture, their language, with their ethnic group, their ethnic identity, all of these things, their religious identities. So talking about the Brazilian and the Colombian and the Barbadian and Jamaican coming together, that will never happen. African American, that will never happen. Because this is not how human nature is. That's what we have to understand. That's what I'm trying here to understand, to get you to understand that human nature is not one in which we are just going to be, all of us are one and let's come together and be one. The people don't think like that. Yes, it's ideal. It would be the ideal for all people to come together and unite against an oppressive system, but it's not going to happen because that is even in Africa, they have their, that's why it leads back to African slave trade, because they have their tribal warfare, right? Why do you think even during the war against Venezuela, when they were leading up to capturing President Maduro, that some Trinidadians were saying, leave us alone. They were saying, all of the other Caribbean, leave us, let us do what is in our best interest. Because that is how they're thinking. They were understanding that Trump was going to give Trinidad some special blessing for helping him to capture Nicolas Maduro. So that's what they thought. And so they wouldn't listen to a Barbadian. They wouldn't listen to a Jamaican or somebody else who's saying, no, don't think like that, because they're saying we must, our national interest predominates any Caribbean sense of Caribbean loyalty. Right? So we have to get out of this notion that we are all this one people, and it's not true. It's not true. And that's why we continue to have these inter-diasporic wars, and we're wondering, where is that coming from? Because we are trying to impose something on people that they are not and will never be. Because that is how, and if you study language and culture, you'll understand that. But many of us don't, so we don't understand that. The nuances of language and culture. Now, we might look the same, but we are not, right? And we might share some similarities, don't get me wrong, but there are lots of other things that are not similar. Now, if you're looking at slavery through the present day lens and trying to seek social justice, now, remember that slavery is going to be a topic forever. Yes, we have to continue to seek social justice, because if we do not learn from the past, then we are going to repeat the errors of the past. Okay? And that is exactly what is happening in our societies right now, because we have failed to learn the history of what took place during our past and some of the uncomfortable truths, and that is what people don't want to hear, right? We're so much attached to what we were told in school, right? And that is not the full reality. Very well said, Joy Reid. Now, Joy Reid is a person who is on the progressive left, right? And so she might say some truth, but she's also on one side, where she is trying to also negate the fact that African people were involved. And there are others on the right who are going to negate the fact that even though Africans were involved, we should stop talking about slavery. And the two are not right. Yes, we need to talk about slavery, not talk about it from one perspective, just like Joy Reid is doing, and another perspective, just like the conservatives are doing. We've got to look at it from a nuanced and an objective perspective, and that is what we can't get Black people to do, and that's why we're getting back on the plantation, and maybe that's where we need to go, because maybe that's where we should, because we don't want to learn. And that is what people do. We blame even God, sometimes when God is telling the truth. And Israel, the Israelites believe the same thing. God is telling them the truth. They don't want to hear it. And then when they went into slavery, they're clamoring and they're crying to God, oh, we'll do whatever you want us to do. And then they go right back, he forgives them, and they do exactly what they did in the past. And Black people are still the same. We are deaf and we don't want to hear the truth. And this is what I'm here. So you either accept it or you reject it. But what is coming is something not pretty. It's hideous. That's the problem. These rich Blacks selling oppression, absolutely. And they do. I have to hear that a lot of these rich Black people do sell oppression. However, Pedro Jamat, we can't ignore the fact that we have to speak about oppressive systems of power. We have to speak about these things, but we must speak about them objectively and not just take one narrative running with it. So that is what we have to understand. It is good to learn our history. That's what Pedro Jamat is saying. Yes, it's good, and it also can be very uncomfortable. That I must say. It's good. At the same time, it is uncomfortable. And I think there is the wisest man, Solomon, says that something about to know knowledge, it gives you pain. Painful to learn a lot of our history. But if we are going to understand where we're going, we must learn it. If not, we are going to repeat the errors of the past. Now, Pedro is saying, so what the past teaches about the said Atlantic slave trade. What it teaches is that human nature is evil. Another thing that it teaches is that we cannot group and say that because we are Barbadians or Trinidadians, that we are all one people, and that everybody is on the same footing and everybody thinks the same way and they will defend your interests because you are Trinidadian and you are Barbadian. It doesn't work like that. The Barbadian can sell out the Barbadian, the Jamaican can sell out the Jamaican, and the Guyanese can sell out the Guyanese, and the African can sell out the African. That's human nature. And the Irish can sell out his own Irish brother, and the Spanish person can sell out his own brother or sister. That is the purpose of the lesson that we're talking about. Slavery is not that we're static and we're trying to just stay there. We're trying to look at a system that is still in operation in a different way, but we're still enslaved. Okay? And that's what we're trying to do in this afternoon's program. And then we have here, it showed race wasn't the main factor. Yeah, well, just like, when Trump went to take out Nicolas Maduro, what did he say? He said that he wanted to spread democracy and all of that stuff. Was that true? No. But he used that. He weaponized democracy against the country and then for Nicolas Maduro. But that was not the full story. That was not the truth. And the same thing, they can weaponize races, color or a nationality against us, and then say that that is what they're defending or not defending. So, but it does mean, therefore, that the realities can be ignored. And the fact that Nicolas Maduro was actually captured, we can't ignore that fact. That the whole matter of democracy was a charade. But the fact is that his government was actually affected by what took place. That is what we have to look at. Now, there are some other clippings that I just want to share with you, because we need to get our acts together in the Caribbean, which I find not a place that we need to. He was captured. He wasn't arrested. He was actually captured. Arrested for what? What did he do? What crime did he commit? Let us look at this, the cost of Black excellence. No, before I go to that, let us look at Harvard complicity in slavery. We look at the academic side of it too, and how academia was also complicit.
University that only exists because of slavery. Ever wonder how Harvard built a $50 billion endowment and became the wealthiest university in the world? The early donors made a killing off the transatlantic slave trade. If we go way back to their founding in 1636, find their presidents, their board members, their faculty, all enslaving Black and indigenous people. Many working right here on this campus. But it doesn't stop there. In the 18 and 1900s, Harvard professors were well known for promoting eugenics. Try to say that people are often Black and brown people, but their conditions were a product of their genetic makeup, their inferiority. I mean, they really promoted this as a legitimate science. They woke up every day trying to prove that the white race was genetically superior. So you telling me all that reading and writing, and you couldn't tell that white wealth and Black poverty came out of slavery? The same slavery their institution contributed to. It was the theories produced here that empowered white doctors to illegally sterilize Black women all across this country. It was the theories produced here that empowered police to assume Black men's criminality and to beat and arrest them and incarcerate them. I got more. Even after slavery ended, that didn't stop Harvard from benefiting from it. A lot of the people that made bread off of slavery, this is where they parked their money. This is where the donations came. You ain't gotta believe me. Read the report on Harvard and the legacy of slavery. Hey, but this will really get me. Even though we know all this history, this is still the school where the Supreme Court banned affirmative action in 2023. Affirmative action is how we go from 100 Black students here in the 1960s to about 1,000 Black students here in the 2020s. It's not like it happened overnight. But now private universities, even those built by slavery, cannot use race in their admissions. So the descendants of slave owners, the descendants of eugenicists who made a fake science, they have a higher chance of getting into Harvard as a legacy than the people who built this school. Welcome to Harvard University.
Right. So even from the higher echelons of the education system, we know that they were also in on slavery. But one of the things that we have to understand, Harvard and these institutions like Princeton's and the Yales of the United States were once religious universities. Do you know that? They started out as religious, not secular institutions. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that while they were religious, there were people, professors who were actually reading the Bible And they realized that the Bible did not endorse slavery, and they wrote against it. So even though they were not particularly, pro-blacks, but they knew that the system was wrong. So that is the whole thing. Some of our leaders and some of our elites, they know what they're doing is wrong, but they know they're so attached to the system. They're so much a part of the system that it's very difficult for them to disunite themselves from the system. So you will hear people talking good and they sound like they're talking the right, using the right words, like the Myanmar and all these people, but they are part of the system. And that you wonder why. You ask yourself why, because they are conflicted. And that's why many of them are not happy. They're not happy, but they cannot. If they ever decide to leave the system, they might receive the angst of the people. So you must understand, this is a very complex situation that we need to explore. It's not just black and white, and some of you think we are looking at a romanticized, movie. Many of you are not understanding the discourse here because you watch too many movies, and the movies have this plot of this bad guy versus the good guy, and you're looking at history from that perspective, and that is not how human nature is. Human nature is not black or white. Human nature is so complex that it is difficult to even understand it. Now, WHZ saying, Pedro, are you trying to absolve white people from chattel slavery? You can't, right? We neither should. When we say white people, we're saying now the white elites, the white merchants. Let's also be very careful with the use of our language, because not all white people were involved in the slave trade. And of course, they have benefited. We can say that they have benefited, but they were not involved. It's almost like Trinidadian leaders. Let us say Trinidad was a country, or Jamaica, and they were involved in the drug trade, which they're not. I hope they're not, right? And these states become wealthy. It does, therefore, the people of Trinidad and Jamaica, because they were involved, the leaders were in the drug trade, that you should blame them. The same thing for America. It's not Americans who are actually killing people in Iraq or in Iran, or it is the leaders, the military-industrial complex, and those elites, but not Americans who are doing it. Because if we say that, we would have to what? Blame Black Americans, Asian Americans, and white Americans, and all of the Americans who are there. Okay, and that's why it's very difficult. We've got to use our language precisely, right? By saying that it is the merchants, it is the elites, and then can say not the ordinary African who was involved. Because how could they everybody involved have that power or authority? Pedro DeMott is saying, how you assume that I blame both or sides, not one? Oh, good, but you talk sometimes, Pedro DeMott, you're sounding like we are just making an alarm, and we're saying now we are not just sounding an alarm, we're saying, yes, we have to be a system, because the system never changed. The system is still in place. White people created and enforced chattel slavery that came about after 1865. Right. The white merchants, they, of course, they were the ones who introduced chattel slavery. However, as we were reading in our article early on, many Black elites in Africa, the merchants and the kings and the ambassadors, the Black ambassadors, they were on ship with some of these Africans, and they saw what was happening. So it means, therefore, that they were complicit. If they saw and never sounded the alarm to have it stopped, they were equally complicit in that sort of arrangement, which they were, right? Which they were. And then we have Africans, so the cattle that should bother you first. Yes, and so we have the merchants of Africa. Remember, guys, I've been saying that to you. The merchants of the world are connected. Again, the merchants of the world, like corporations, they are connected. So the richest merchant in Trinidad is connected to the richest merchant in America. They cohabit, they coexist. So if the American merchant merchant says to the Trinidadian merchant, you have to exploit your Trinidadian citizens, they will, because the two are one. They work against our interests and work in the interests of their kind. And that's what we're trying to understand. So don't think now if we say, oh, it's Trinidad who did that. Not because a rich Trinidadian merchant was involved in something that is bad. It means to now say the entire Trinidadian population and to the Ghanaian population that they are guilty. No. And that is what we do. All right. We have to now try to, to separate the merchant class, the elites, the top-notch people from the common man. And then you'll see that, that these people, the ordinary people, the middle-class people, the working-class peoples of the world are not involved because these elites don't care about them. Okay, and their interests. And that is why in today's world, you are saying, oh, my president is not doing anything for me, or my prime minister is not doing anything. Yes, because they're not working in your interests. They're not working in your interest. And very soon you will know. You're gonna know very soon when they are going to put you and sell you to other merchants when they re-establish slavery. They will. You wait, because they're going to do it. No one is on this. Only you are focused on absolving white people, white merchants. Remember again, saying white merchants, we can't say that we all white people were involved. In fact, some white people were in very, very serious problems when slavery was going on because they were treated so badly. And we know that lots of even the Irish and whatever, they were also indentured slaves as well. Now, Pedro Martin is saying, you are certainly lacking comprehension. Sorry. Now, let's be respectful to each other. It's a difficult subject to really maneuver, and we will have difference in opinions, but let's be respectful. Okay, that's the whole purpose of this dialogue, that we wanted to have a sincere, open, transparent dialogue, because you're not seeing it in other channels, because we more believe in the drama and the clownmanship that we see on other podcasts in the region. Now we have stopped trying to absolve white people. That will never happen. Absolve whom? Well, the fact of the matter is white or black merchants. We can't absolve neither. That's the whole point, WHZ. We can't absolve neither of the white merchants nor, and we can say white corporations or black corporations, we can't absolve any of them, okay, because they are all guilty as charged. And then we have Pedro saying connected through maritime law. And then we have here Pedro, so will you, your ancestors were probably slaves. Now, you see, we can get into it, and that's why when we get disunited, God fight for ourselves, right? We have to stay, understand that we think differently, because when it comes down to slavery, we get so, heated up, right? Because it's a very sensitive topic, and I know that, but we have to understand that we have to put our personal way and how we view the world. What we do have to understand is that we have to look at the facts and at all narratives and try to come up with a sense of what really took place and what it means for us in the society in which we live. Now, look at this. I wanted to look at this because to some extent, it still connects to what we're talking about, even though we looked at this subject yesterday. But look at what this guy here is saying.
That reside in academia, if not all of them, are truly exceptional. Yet, we have a system in place that subjugates them and doesn't allow them to follow the arc of that trajectory.
First of all, rest in peace to Jason Arde. Watching the kind of brutal smear campaign that should be reserved for PDF files and serial killers be placed on top of his head for something like plagiarism has been strange, to say the least. It's been strange to witness. My thoughts during this time are with his family and his loved ones. This whole spectacle for me highlights something really important about the idea of Black excellence, right? And the way in which we pedestalize the idea of Black excellence as Black people, how it can actually be a threat to our collective safety. Examples of Black excellence are often, if not always, making reference to a Black person's or a group of Black people's ability to gain some kind of recognition or rank within a colonial white institution, right? The kind of institution that has been hostile towards us and caused us quite a lot of harm. It applauds us for finding our way into and maintaining positions in institutions that deny our humanity, systems that require us to perform and to prove ourselves continuously, systems that require proof that we are the good Black, the exceptional Black. And these are systems and institutions that continuously police us and put us under levels of scrutiny that they don't even reserve for PDF files, right? Actual criminals, rapists, right? In fact, as long as these people are white, they are often able to navigate these kinds of institutions and gain positions of power, right, and governance. And this is what makes the idea of Black excellence essentially unattainable, right? Because the colonial systems and ways of living that validate and qualify that standard of so-called excellence will always make sure that it's unattainable for you. They will always make sure that it's a shifting goalpost. They will pull the rug from underneath your feet. They will throw you under the bus. They will require your self-betrayal and therefore your self-harm. You can never be rooted in something that an external power that doesn't recognize your humanity gets to define and to dictate. And that's why I believe that attempting to do so will always be a siphoning of your life force energy as a Black woman, as a Black person. That's why rebellion and radical self-acceptance need to be the starting point in how you direct your life, because any other thing is a threat to your well-being. Your worthiness is in the I am. Your worthiness is in your existence, and you do not need a Western colonial standard of excellence to validate your existence or your worthiness. It really is time for us as Black women, for us as Black people to
So
get off
we
that.
got the point that she's making here. It's a whole matter of the fact where, white people set this high standard for Black people. Whenever you're part of their institutions, like even the government, they will set the highest standards for democracy in the Caribbean, in Africa, which they don't really follow, right? And then they tell the world that you are corrupt and that is corrupt. At the same time, they're the ones who are leading that behind the corruption, and they're guilty as charged, but that is what they do. And that is why we have to find a way in our system. The problem with us in the Caribbean and in Africa and in what we call the Black world is that we want to live in the white world, but we want to have our cake and eat it at the same time. We can't have our cake and eat it at the same time. So you can't be in bed with them and be corrupt like them and expect that you are going to be absolved of your immoral standards. And that is what Black people want to do. We want to be able to benefit from the illegal system, from the immoral system, and then we say that we are upright people and they don't have the moral rectitude like Black people have, and we cannot live like that. This is a problem with a lot of us as Black people, and we've got to change and break that fallow ground. Welcome to the Live Z. How were slaves treated in African societies? First, I think this must be understood. Were slaves brutalized or were they treated in a dignified manner? Well, I don't think any system of slavery treats slave in a dignified manner. I think they were brutalized, but not necessarily in the same way as we have the chattel, because the chattel slavery said that we are not actually human beings. I think the difference with all forms of slavery before this transatlantic slavery was that the slaves, to some extent, the slaves were humans. They had some really brutal systems, including in Africa, right, and in the Middle East, some brutal systems of slavery, right, in which the slave masters treated their slaves horribly. We must also understand that during the Dark Ages in Europe, under their dark period, during the medieval era, that they were also treated like animals. And you really wonder, when you read the Spanish Inquisition and many of the Inquisitions that you had in Europe, they were treated and hounded like animals, like wild animals. And you really wonder if they learned from that system, and that is why they were so brutal in the transatlantic slavery. It's something to explore. You know, the Dark Ages in Europe, and after they had become enlightened, and the fact that during their enlightenment, by the way, let me say this. It was during European Enlightenment, when the science and everything, they were educated and going to school and developing different technologies, that slavery happened. Let me repeat that. It was during the period of what you call Enlightenment, European Enlightenment, that they practiced the worst form of slavery that humanity has ever had. So don't you ever think because we're living in AI and we have all these modern things and we think we're so enlightened that slavery cannot happen, and happen in the most brutal way. It is when we are prosperous that we need to be very careful of what that slavery might occur. Why? Because people are getting rich. And the richer people get, the more wealth that they yearn for, the more power that they accumulate is the more power that they yearn for, and the more brutal and cruel they will work toward accomplishing that feat. So do not believe that we can't have a worse form of slavery in our days, and I think we will. Why? Because we have the technologies and we see the concentration of power and money going into the hands of very few people. So yes, Z, I think that there were other systems of slavery, but not the fact that I've not read of any that said that any human being was actually not human. But implicit in the whole matter of slavery is that you are inferior. They're calling you slaves, right? It means therefore that you're inferior, whether you're indentured or you are a chattel. But the chattel slave was actually treated in the most brutal way, because he was regarded like he had no soul, no mind, no nothing. He was property. He was considered, or she, to be just mere property. So that is it. We did have that nuanced conversation at the beginning of the live, so you can rewind it, Z, and you'll find what we said during there. Look into the slave markets. They were bought from, and you say Cambridge. Somebody's saying here Cambridge did move him. Why should he be thinking? Then we have here, this is how Epstein got his way in it and was encouraged to do what he did. Right. Epstein, when we think about Epstein too, and he was tied to the education system, including Harvard. He had an office at Harvard University. That was Epstein, right? And Epstein is tied, as we learned from the secret society conversation, he was tied to the Illuminati and also to the Vatican, right? So we have to explore that. Yes, these saying slaves in some ancient societies enjoyed basic human rights. Their humanness were respected. That's what I mean, right? So I don't know if they had lots of human rights, but their humanity was recognized, right? But it did mean that some of the slave masters did not go overboard, and they did not do some very wicked things to them, right? But the system of slavery, because let us look at even for those of you who believe in the Jews, when they were in Egypt, they went through some very rigorous, they went through some terrible things. Alexis says, yes, that is so. See, Trump and Netanyahu, genocide on Palestine, Trump's ambition to wipe Iran off the face of the earth. Right. It's when we are more enlightened that now when we have technologies and we're seeing that our society seems to be modern, that we should be shaking. And what is more important, we see the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. We should be shaking now to say something is going to happen. Something has to give. And it's generally slavery again. Because these people, these billionaires, right? Look at Elon Musk. Elon Musk is about to become a trillionaire. A trillionaire. And look at how he sees human beings. He doesn't see us as equal to him. He sees us, we should be. In fact, Elon Musk believes that he should be living on a different planet. He thinks that living with human beings is something inferior, because that's how he thinks. how he looks on us. So they see us as just objects. Right now, we might not be linked as property, but they see us as objects, right? A data. They don't see us as full human beings. So when we think that we are not going to be another form of chattel, might not happen. It is today that it will happen because they have the technologies, right, to control us and to surveil us and to make into just data. Right? Look at the pandemic. They never thought we could think for ourselves. My God, we could not look at the different, debates about the medicine, the medication, and think whether we want to or not. They just believe that whatever they tell us to do as machines, we ought to do it. So it's now that we are so enlightened that we should say, and we claim that we are a modern society, that we should understand that another system of slavery could be brewing, and we might just be used as just, oh, he just robot, that's another machine, that person, okay, and work that person to death. Look at the robots now. What if very soon robots can't get tired? They might say that we have to work like the robots. Right? Very soon say, well, the robots can work. It's working and giving much more hours and more work than you can. Do it. And it's going to happen. Z saying, in many West African societies, settlement and domestic slaves were culturally integrated and treated as junior family members. Therefore, it is Africans selling slaves believe they'd be real well. Yes, some were and some were not. Remember now that every slave was not seen. Just even look at the transatlantic slave trade too. All the slaves were not treated equally, right? We had the house slaves and you had the field slaves. So slaves come in hierarchy. So let's not also group slavery and say this was what it is and that was it. There were some slaves. Look at Toussaint. Toussaint was a slave, but eventually, through his wisdom and the fact that he was close to the slave master, he was able to get free, and that is how he gained his freedom. So not all slaves had a similar experience, so we have to understand that, right? There's more nuance to it than we can. There's some and experience not a real terrible time as the majority might have, right? So let's not put it into one box, but look at the entire system. Slavery in all forms should not be. But if it is, it should have rules. And you're right, Z, because even the Bible did not endorse slavery. What it says, if you have one, because they wanted slaves, the Bible didn't want them to even have a king, and they wanted it, and God gave them a king because God wanted to teach them how he viewed, because we are like slaves, and he's telling us, look here, you were slaves in Egypt and you didn't like it, so why are you treating your slaves in that very inhumane way? And when we have here, will you buy a horse to plow a ground and break its leg? Now, what's the point here, Pedro? I'm not sure what point you're raising here. Could you tell us what you mean by your, again, mysterious language? Tell us what you mean by buying. What do we do with that? Okay, so any other question? I think that this was a very serious conversation that we had here. Wish more of you were here to join the conversation because this was something that is very important. Yes, you're right, Andrew. But in many cases, the severe maltreatment began only when the slaves were turned over to European possession. Yeah, we're not arguing that because the European possessions, they regard. Remember, we're saying too that I was of the impression, Z, that many of our Black merchants were not aware of what took place on the plantations. But we're learning that some of them were. And some of them were even on the slave ships. Some of the ambassadors, African ambassadors, some of the kings, they came here to the Americas and they saw, but they never ended it, right? They saw the maltreatment and that it was something unique, but they were making lots of money from it. I believe, to Z, that some of they don't like the policies that they have to impose upon us. They see the suffering. They see our pain, but they cannot but do it because they're lining their pockets. The IMF and these people are lining their pockets with money and with prestige and with honor, so they continue to do it. Right? So it's not that they don't want to stop it, it's that they don't want to, to let go of their power, right? And the perks that come with, imposing those austerity measures on us. So we have President Monty saying the slave that was mistreated was when he wouldn't follow. Come on now. Come on, Pedro. If you read the history of slavery and you see what happened on the slave ships and the fact that they were, sort of huddled together and, we don't have to repeat that. You have to read that history, Pedro. It's not those who only didn't obey. They were treated badly, right? And when they couldn't finish a work that from a human perspective, no human could accomplish that work, they would be beaten to death and they were separated from their families. It's just a list of things that should not have been done. So don't tell us about the fact that they did not do what they were supposed to do or they were not obedient, right? That is not true. It is chattel slavery and Arab slavery that were inhumane, right? I think all slavery is inhumane, but we can talk about the degrees of it being inhumane. But we can't say slavery is not something good, right? In no sense of the word. It means that you're bonded, you're free to do whatever you want to do, and you're not free to think, and that in itself is not good. It's in no form is good, but some are milder, I agree with you, than others. That we can agree on. The slaves then held in shackles in the market, right? That was terrible. That was terrible. And we have Pedro can't face the truth. Pedro doesn't like to hear about that. I don't know why Pedro is always trying to justify what happened. That's why I said about Pedro. Yeah, Pedro doesn't like to talk about slavery. Or he thinks, and that's what we're saying, people, we don't want to be on one side to the extreme, another side to the extreme. We don't want to say that all Europeans are bad, and we don't want to say that all Europeans were good. We're not on that side. We're trying to make sense of the system and telling you that you have to separate merchants, whether they're black or white, or Chinese or Europeans, from the ordinary people who might not have participated. Would you damage your property? You were there. Nobody is human property, right? They were considered as property, but they weren't property. And that is what the Europeans had to understand. That's why it came down, because they realized when the slaves rose up and destroyed the system, then white people understood that they were living in a delusional world, thinking that a human being is property. No human being is property, right? We are not property of anyone. We might be forced into that sort of illusionary deal, but eventually that system will come down. Right? Slaves were law-abiding people captured to be brutalized into obedience. Correct. Most of them were law-abiding people. And then we have these saying, you see, we also need to recognize the power differential between Europeans and Africans. The Europeans were factually superior militarily and technologically, so Africans could reject their demand. We talked about that today. Earlier in the live, so you have to go back and rewind ZE. But the fact of the matter is that if we think that all the time, then you're going to say we don't have agency then, and we would have to say whites are superior. If we say these things and we don't look at them in depth. If we're thinking that there's no other way but to do what you're telling us to do, it means that they're superior, right? And I don't think they're superior. If we don't have agency to say that we are going to say, I'm going to fight to the very death, then you don't deserve freedom. Okay? And that is the whole point. That's why many people fell for the pandemic. So, I don't have a job if I don't take the vaccines, so I don't have agency, I have to do what I'm told, then you don't deserve freedom. Because your freedom has been taken away from you, and that is exactly what happens did. You'll want to blame one side, enjoy without my support, blame both, move on. But that's what we're doing here. That's what we're doing here. We're trying to look at all sides, not only one. Pedro posed a trick question. Glad you do not fall. And we have the Z. So you weren't stronger then, hence the missionaries win your souls. Then we have here, no, Andrew, only in the specific context. You shouldn't take that context and generalize it. Yeah, I'm not generalizing it. I'm just saying that that's the argument that we use a lot of times during slavery, and history tells us that the Europeans were superior militarily and technology, and I probably would think it's true, right? However, I think that if we'd had this sort of resolve, that we would not have sold out many people. I think it was more business, Z, than it was a sense of morality. In the same way, I talk about, what is happening here in the region. I don't think our leaders want to sell us out per se, and Europeans still have superior military arms and technologies, by the way. But I think if Caribbean leaders have the resolve, they could unite and stand up to the colonial masters, right, to the United States and to Europe. However, we do not decide to do that because our leaders or politicians, they prefer money to, moral standards. So they would rather sell us out than standing up for us. And that's exactly what happened in Africa. The merchants earned money from it, and they weren't thinking in terms of just technological superiority. They were thinking about making billions of dollars and getting assets and power from the proceeds of slavery. Glad you did not fall for Pedro trick question. Those white people were delusional if they thought black people were property. Yeah, I've always corrected even white people. I know we read the history. History says that, right? That we were property. I tell people when I read the books, I said, no, we were not property. We were considered as property. There is a difference between both statements, but we were not property. And slaves are not slaves, but, they were forced into that condition, and that's why people think that they are. And that's why eventually they killed their masters, and their masters understand that they do not. In fact, go and read the book Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. When he describes how the Africans on the plantation used to talk about, in secret, they used to talk about their European slave masters. They made fun of them, and they thought that they were stupid. They thought that they were inferior to them. The African slaves were discussing that in secrecy among themselves. They laughed and they made fun of the European slave masters. Go and read that book, a very well-written book by C.L.R. James, the book The Black Jacobins. Now we have Z saying guns were imported into Africa. That's right. Africa did not have guns. You're correct. They did not have cannons, right? Africans weren't as savagely warlike as Europeans. Yes, I agree with you. That's what the history tells us. But at the end of the day, we want to look at what the elites and the merchants wanted versus what the African masses wanted. The same thing we can do, I was trying to say, Z, that we have to look at what Caribbean people want versus what the leaders of our time desire. And we're looking at the fact that many of our leaders want money. They want power. They want prestige. They want honor. So in doing that, they will sell out the Caribbean citizens at the spur of the moment, right? And we're saying, but you think he's Barbadian or he's Guyanese, so he should be working on your behalf. At the end of the day, he's not working on your behalf. He's working on behalf of himself, his family, and the global merchants and elites. So that's what we're saying here. We're not looking at Africans as a group of people who sold themselves out. We're looking at the African merchants, the African elite, right? The African power center that actually sold out their people in the same way that the Caribbean elites and power centers and economic elites are selling us right here in the Caribbean at this current moment. All right. So when we look at America and just think America did everything that they're doing and we don't have an agency, we don't have any agency because we are not united. We are not united. We have our leaders who are hypocrites and who are betrayers, and they sell us out for the highest common denominator. Okay, Pedro is saying, just like today, presently, they have the material but lack processing. Right, they have the material but lack. But I agree with you, Z. I'm 100% agreement that they do have military weapons superior to us. But I think life is much more than just about military might. I think if you have moral standards and if you fight, if you unite, you still can win them. Look at the slaves. Let us go back to the slaves. Look at the slaves in Haiti, in Saint Domingue. These were Haitians with what? They didn't have any weapons, right? Mind you, I think the United States did sell them some weapons, did sell Toussaint some weapons. But the fact of the matter, most of them fought with their sticks and stones, right? Back what they had, and they defeated 3 major empires of the time because they were united under the right leadership, under the right form of leadership. Thank God, Toussaint Louverture did not betray them. Had he betrayed the Haitian slaves, they couldn't have won. Because, of course, the Europeans had what? They had the weapons. They had the military technology. Okay, but the slaves in Saint Domingue, they united under their generals. Well, we had Toussaint and the other one, what's his name? Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And they were able to win these 3 major European empires of the day. And saying all of this suggests the call for European reparations is entirely valid, but how it is being done is wrong. Yes, you're correct. We said that too. We're saying people who are asking for reparations, or politicians or business elites, are benefiting from the slave system that they have inherited, right? So it's not only how it's done, it's by the people who are demanding it. And if they have enslaved us and they are benefiting from the system of slavery in the Caribbean, why should we give monies to them to actually dispense to us? They're not going to do it because they're already not working for our interests. So it's not only the methodology, the how, as you're saying, I agree with you, Z, but the people who are demanding it are the same oppressors, or same oppressors who are functioning within a system that is still enslaved, and they have enslaved us for all the time, telling us that we have freedom when we have none, telling us that we are independent when we are not independent. Okay, these are the people who are calling for it, and they're benefiting, and they are millionaires. Many of them are billionaires and millionaires, and they benefit from the system of slavery. So we need to have our leaders make reparations to us first. The first thing that they need to do is to get the land, have people get their rightful land. Right? When you go to Jamaica, you see a lot of land, empty land, owned by the government and the crown, their crown lands, and people are landless. They're saying that 1/3 of Jamaican population are landless. They have no land, and that is coming from slavery. Okay, coming from slavery, and yet still Jamaica became independent in 1962, and they made no sort of attempt to sort of deal with that system, that unjust system. Okay, so our politicians would be the first to make the reparations, and then they can ask the Europeans to do that, because they have benefited from the system and they have stolen a lot from us too. WHD saying the average African man is in survival mode, but the elites are in greed mode. Right. And the thing in the can. So we say that not only, I am making this here because I want to compare what happens in Africa to what is happening here in the diaspora, in the Caribbean diaspora, also in the African American society. That most of these people are grifters. They're not people who want to help you. A lot of our Black leaders too are grifters. They're not there to help you. And that is what we're saying. And if they do get in reparations, they're not going to help you. They are going to divide it among themselves and to defend the agenda of the global elites. That's what we're saying here. Can we say, Andrew, that the Caribbean politician is a neo-imperialist puppet? Yes, a puppet never has agency. Interesting. If we don't have agency, then we're not free, and then we are just like robots, right? And I agree with you. So it means, therefore, that if we are like that, and I think to a large extent it's true, right? But then we have to acknowledge, therefore, that they are superior because we have no agency. Anybody without agency means that they are inferior. The slave is inferior to his slave master because he has no agency, right? And that's the whole thing. So how do we argue then that we are not inferior? I'm not saying we are, but if we have no agency, how do we argue that the white man is not superior? That's a question that we have to answer in this live. Difficult, perhaps. Think about it. I have noticed that each race of people have a common set of values as characteristics. Europeans are driven by greed, domination, and destruction. And we have here, is it by people black people, black people appear to value something spiritual. Yes, and yeah. I agree with you. I agree 100% with you. I agree 100% with you. But to an extent, too, Alexis, I think that black people have also adopted a lot of the traits, not we, the common people, but sometimes we, the common people, also. But I think we have adopted some of the traits of the dominant European who want to dominate and to be wealthy. And I think in today's time, we are less spiritual than we were. We are more materialistic now than we were in Africa. And that is a fact. Okay? The typical African American in the United States is much more materialistic than spiritual than he was during the decade of Martin Luther and the Malcolm X's. These people were more spiritual. Now we are more clamoring for money and power, right? Very, very, very true point. Our elites, politicians don't work for us now, so why would they responsibly dispense reparations to us? And that's the whole point. This is the connection we have to make. If they have not really worked for us since independence and to bridge the gap, then how are they going to bridge the gap now? After 64 or 60 years, how many years of independence that each Caribbean country is actually celebrating? I think it's coming up. Trinidad's independence is coming up on August 31st. So if the politicians have not bridged the gap since independence, well, in a minute manner, they have not done a lot that they could have done. Can we say, Andrew, that the Caribbean politician is a puppet of I think I saw this already. Yes, and I'm wondering, let me repeat that, does not have agency. The Caribbean politicians really cannot help us badly as it sounds. So we don't have any agency then. How can we get agency? Because until we get agency, and that's what Marcus Garvey was saying, then we are slaves. And we are inferior to the white man. Okay? We're inferior. Because what do we own? What do we own here in the Caribbean? What do black people own in the United States? Nothing, but some culture, and the culture has been exploited by the same Europeans. Okay, so we're inferior. How do we change that? How do we change our current state of inferiority if we have no agency? Because if we don't have any agency, we can't just think that because you have some education and you're working a decent job and earning a few bucks now, that determines who you are. All right? We have to be able to live in a society in which, as a group of people, we have some form of agency. And it appears, as he's saying, we have none. How do we earn or get some agency? Ghana, that pushing shouldn't be asked to pay, right, to pay. And I heard that the president of Ghana did, his family benefited from slavery. That's exactly what Kwame was right. Yeah. If we don't have agency, people are in serious trouble, right? If we don't have agency, we are, as a people, in serious problem. Maybe that's why Alexander and Nkrumah, as he's saying, wanted Black people to be separate and to have separate economies. And I think it was Marcus Garvey who was saying that if they have a Harvard, Black Harvard, a white Harvard rather, we should have a Black Harvard and vice versa. Black people like to dance and sing, and we smile and are happy more than other races. And is it because they have imposed that on us? I don't think that we were forever like that, because the Africans who come from, for example, WHZ, the Africans from the continent who go to the United States, they're much different and are higher achievers than African Americans are. And to some extent, Caribbean Black people too. Okay, so is it that we have learned, we have internalized the stereotypes of white people, and we are actually behaving likewise? You know, we have to look at these things. It means, Andrew, that we are saying we are not inferior emptily. We don't have equal evidence to support that belief. We say to preserve our dignity. You correct? You're correct. We say these things, and we believe more in Pan-Africanism than in developing economies that will show that we are not inferior. So we go to conferences and we write books about the kingdoms of Ghana and the kingdoms of all of these African countries, and yet still we are poor and we have no agency. So how can we be equal? You know, that is a question we have to ask. I'm not laughing here at us. You know, I'm laughing at what we do and how we are clowns in many ways. We're clowns. Independence brought parliamentary independence, and people must first know what that means. I got you. Yeah, so we should know, you're correct, we should know our parliamentary independence. First of all, we should know our constitution. So that I agree with you, Pedro. Let's go to WHZ saying we don't own because of the policies that have been enforced, for example, ownership of property. Right. So yes, so we know that, WHZ. So what are we doing about it? Because just like the slaves knew that they were slaves, and they rose up in slavery, and they had frequent rebellions. They had frequent slave disruptions of the system until they brought it down. So the slaves accepted that they were slaves. Are we accepting that we're still slaves and that the fight was never over? All right? We think the fight is over and that we can sit and claim the rights as ours, but nobody owes us anything, right? We've got to fight for what we have. And many of us think that we can just sit and go to conferences and talk on lives like these, and things are going to change overnight. No, we have to fight for that. And we have no agency now. So if we don't have any agency, I think we have to accept our lots that we're slaves until we become free. If we have our agency, then we can say that we are free citizens of the world. Andrew Bingo, we need to first tell ourselves the truth. Absolutely. By lying to ourselves, we keep comfortable and live an illusion. And that's why we are singing and dancing, because that is the therapy. We have to sing. We have to dance. We have to go to parties. We can't listen to lives like these, because lives like these, first we have to think on lives like these. And we're not like the Z's and the Pedro de Mots and the Trevors and the Maries of the Caribbean. We don't want to be thinkers. We want to be people who just sit down and accept what we're told and move on. We keep comfortable and live in illusion. That's exactly what the Eurocentric world wants. Absolutely. We're right. We have fallen right into their hands, because the exact thing that we claim we aren't, we are. Illusion, more delusion. Yeah, it's both. You know, it's both. And the Caribbean people and Black people in general tell themselves too many lies. Yeah, and the history too. The historian, we look at history from the right and from the left, and that is not how history should be taught. It should be looked at every angle. History should be looked at from every angle, not just from the right and the left, not from the Jamaican Trinidadian perspective or the Ghanese perspective, but from as a whole. History should be looked at as a whole. No dancing and singing, WHZ saying, and happiness was always part of us, but our best qualities were used negatively. I got you. For example, criminalizing blackness. You're right. I think that we have overemphasized these traits, WH, that what you're saying, that we have put too much emphasis on these things, but we were always a dancing, singing, happy people. I agree with you. But we have, too much of nothing is good. So if I like to eat dumplings, or I like to eat, tofu, or if I like to eat, anything, it means that it's not good. It's not good. And too much of dancing and singing and making fool of ourselves is not good. Andrew, in response, we are allowed only 2 sentences. Ow. On the chat? Is that on the chat? That's terrible. Andrew, we tell ourselves the lie that the fight is over. Yes, and that is the problem. And then we have some very good responses I'm getting. Andrew, excellent point. And then we have WHZ, Alexis is saying, Black people are as serious about life as any other race, but they are impeded in every instance. I don't know if we're serious anymore. I think as WHZ is saying, the entertainers, white people have been good. You know what they did? They co-opted our entertainment or culture, and they use now our entertainers to make us look like we are not serious people. We don't dress seriously anymore. We don't talk seriously anymore. We don't take life seriously anymore. We're productive citizens anymore. We want to be like the dancehall singer and the hip hop whatever and the latest entertainer, the next footballer, the next basketball player. That is how we have been now conditioned. And because of that, we are not as serious as, I saw this Black person on TikTok the other day, and he was literally crying. You know what he said? He said, many African Americans are leaving and going to college, and they cannot read and write. And he cried. He's a teacher. He said they cannot write a sentence, right? And they've left high school, and they have been admitted to college. And one of the on the video, after the video, on the video, was that the whites are able to do it. Whites are able to do it because the whites take life more seriously. They know when to enjoy themselves, and they know when it's time to work, when it's time to be serious. We don't want to be serious at any time, right? Look at this conversation we're having. If it were going through, you'd see thousands of them on the live because they want to make sense. They like to make sense of what is happening in the world. We don't, right? We want to go on a podcast with some drama about Mia Motley and what she's doing and some gossips, and you hear some Caribbean music and you dance, and that is what you want to do. That's the level of thinking in the Caribbean. WHZ, do we use our dancing and singing as a form of escapism? Yeah, it's a form of escapism. Escapism, yeah, it's a form. Yeah, it is. Right? It's therapy. And we can't blame ourselves. If we did not have it, I think we have more votes in the Caribbean, and I don't know what would have happened to us. Pedro de Marti saying Caribbean next fight. Remember too that the slaves used music and dancing as that of escapism too, right? Remember that was what happened to the plantation. They sang, but their songs were more uplifting, and they were singing about leaving plantation and becoming free and becoming productive citizens, right? Their songs were deep. Look at the spirituals. Their songs were deep. Ours are not. Ours are not. Our songs right now are more destroying us than any other thing. So we can't even compare ourselves with even the slaves who couldn't read and write, but they were able to put words together and begin to sing songs that are more uplifting and that have been able to stand the test of time. These spirituals will never die and they will never grow old. But all the songs that you're hearing on Black people singing right now, most of them are not even for a year or two. Caribbean next fight is getting public status. And guess what? The land will still be crown land. You're right here. I have to agree with you, Pedro Jamon. Yeah, it's all about the name and the symbolism. Oh, we are republic, right? And then you own no land. You're landless. You're correct. And yes, you're correct. And then thank you, Z. And then we have WSD saying, Z, no, we do not believe so entirely. Our culture is being used against us for sure, though. Yeah, but we have to have, again, go back to agency, WHZ. If we don't have an agency to stand up and to preserve our culture, something is wrong, right? We need to go back to the points of who has agency and who doesn't. And if we don't have agency, then we are slaves. The EU supports culture industry in CARICOM, and you're right. And then Z saying escapism does actually help us to escape. It is more like, is it delayism? Yeah, you're correct. You're correct. It is more like that. And we have to get ourselves together and understand that we are living in some very, very strange time. Remember, I told you that don't think that because we are now living in what you think is enlightened time with your phones and you have all of these gadgets, it's now the time, that the right time in which slavery can recur and we might be enslaved. Even the Trini Calypso had some political symbolism, but now it's only wine and alcohol. Right. Even that back then, the Calypso music, right, would have the Trinidadian Calypso would have some form of political commentary, right? And that is why people liked reggae music too, because they thought that it spoke about liberation of Africa and African peoples. But now they have moved away from that. And guess who is now the winners of reggae music? People, the Europeans, right? Reggae music is no longer associated with Jamaica. Jamaicans are no longer they are the owners of reggae music, but they are no longer the producers of good quality reggae music. So it means, therefore, where is our agency? Where is our agency? And Z saying, if your culture is being used against you, then you don't own it. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. And that's why when you hear the Grammys going to foreigners, and they should be in the Caribbean because it's our music, Calypso, Trinidadian, reggae, Jamaican, and so forth. No, but other people are taking these things over because they're now owning our production. Andrew, it's called digital imperialism. We have absolutely no control of our digital lives. And that's a new form of slavery. Slavery is not to recur perhaps in the way in which we thought slavery was, but it's a new form of slavery, which is digital slavery, as he's saying. Indeed, why our land still crown land, which means we have no ownership or sovereignty. We make no attempt to change this power structure. No, because I think people think, again, Alexis, that we just need to sit on a live and dance and prance, and then Mia Motley is going to change and she's going to give us the land that we so deserve. If you had a culture, you would be living it, not recreating culture. Well, culture is always be created. There's no other way. You can't, culture is not static. It's always evolves. Okay? And remember now, let us look at Barbados, Pedro Jamont. When Miss Mia Motley is going to invite Africans from Africa to join the Barbadian culture, if you should have a significant number of Africans going to Barbados, the culture is going to metamorphose. Okay? It's going to change. It's going to evolve. Okay, so we can't say that culture remains static. It evolves and it can recreate itself. Cultures often recreate themselves, but we're saying who owns them, right? Who owns them is another case. It should be Barbadian, even though many Africans will join it and it will evolve, but it still should remain holistically Barbadian. But if it is sold and commercialized, then it's no longer Barbadian. And that's the point we're making. And Andrew, what is happening to the push for beach access in Jamaica? How has that push been going? Not good, because what they're doing, they're not only even taking the beaches now, Z, they're taking the lands. They're taking away people's lands. Right now, there's a push now for Andrew Holness he's saying that he wants to give people a title, but when I listen to him on title, when I listen to him carefully, what they're going to do is literally take away people's lands from them by telling them that this land was never yours. Okay? So the beach access is just, the precursor before they come and they take away the lands that people grew up on and their parents and their grandchildren were on. Involves mean it is not original. No, Pedro. What are you saying? The Barbadan culture of the 1860s is not the same culture of the 2026. It does mean, therefore, that the Barbadan culture is original. It is original, right? But it's not the same. Even the 1990s is just not the same. It evolves. And you know that, Pedro. It is the same. Yeah, it's the same. It doesn't mean, therefore, but it has changed. It's not going to remain static. Right? It's not going to remain static. Before the large people went to Trinidad, it was different. When they came to Trinidad, Indians came to Trinidad and other groups came to Trinidad, they formed a culture and refashioned and it's now a culture. And it is absolutely diluted culture. Indian culture is Americanized. I think all of our cultures can say that now. We have become Americanized, and that's right. We have accepted this Americanized version of what our cultures should be, and that is sad. But it's a false American culture too. We often take the type of American culture that is non-productive and that is not uplifting. We do not select the part of American culture where time matters, where productivity is essential, and other good qualities that they have. And I complain about that too in other parts of the Caribbean region, that we adopt the forms of American culture. That is the meaning, and that does not give ourselves any meaning at all. Right now, everything is race, is black or white. And I'm like, we did not grow up in that Caribbean culture of everything is racially based. We're not saying now that, like in Trinidad and Guyana, you don't have racial and ethnic division. Yes, that is a reality, as always. But the black narrative in the Caribbean that is mostly American lingo is affecting and is going to destroy the very fabric of this region. Right, because that is not our reality. Let's talk about the classism and the ethnic, divisions, like in Trinidad and also in Guyana. That needs to be rectified still. But this black and white thing that I see most of us, like the Lion Champions, talking about and so on, is not our reality. It's not our reality, and it's just a distraction. Looking at the real centers of power in the Caribbean and attacking them rather than spending efforts on this white-black nonsense. In America, it's a fact, it's a reality, but in the Caribbean, it's the same. The beaches are a mess in TNT as well. Yes, they're taking over everything because it's land too, what is that they're trying to arrest these beaches and put up properties on them, beachfront properties, and they earn lots of monies and, tourists come over and pay big bucks to stay there. Do you believe that? Go ahead. Japan. And Alexis is saying culture must change when something or someone comes in. Yeah, it's going to change. There's no way you can't. It's going to change, right? And it needs to change too. Our cultures, the culture would be very boring if it didn't change, right? We need cultural change, but we need positive cultural change. And it should not be where people are imposing upon you, right? Because we know that we've always had immigration to Barbados, immigration to Trinidad and Tobago, to whatever country, right? What they're doing now, they're imposing upon us a new form of immigration that might create problems, these saying, I think, Andrew, that the American imposition of American culture on the Caribbean is the most powerful form of the Monroe Doctrine. You're correct. You are correct, because guess why? We are essentially accepting it without any form of, pushback, right? Because we love the music, we love what we see, and we love to be all of the people are in their wigs and, and doing what Americans do in wigs in a hot climate. Women are in wigs in a hot climate. And even men are in hot clothes, wearing these leather jackets in a hot climate, because you have to be fashionable and you have to look like the hip hop singer and star, right? So yeah, we're behaving stupidly. And we have to have all these shoes in our closets, right? Just like the Americans do, right? The sort of vanity that we see in the Caribbean is coming from the United States and this materialistic culture. Indian culture and African culture never fused. Only in the last 20 years, Indians are suddenly participating in carnival. It's for economic control. I am sure that you have some, differences between the Indians and the Black Trinidadian. However, when I look at them, I've not been to Trinidad, by the way. One day I need to come. But the fact is that when you look outsiders, when we see an Indian Trinidadian and a Black Trinidadian, they speak the same, their education and of course and their class and all that stuff. But to me, they eat the same foods. Don't you eat the same foods? Right? And you have the same accent, depending again on your education and what region you might come from in Trinidad, whether you're from the east or the west or, the north. But the fact of the matter is, it's not like America, where you see Black Americans have a distinct accent from, white Americans. And in some cases, the culture might even be different. Right? In some cases, depending again on their education and their, exposure, it might be different, because you can have the white person behaving like Black and the Black behaving like white. It's complicated. But the fact is that in Trinidad and even in Brazil, where you have lots of white people too, they don't speak differently from the Black Brazilian. Right? And as I'm saying, this Black-white thing might not be applicable in some cases to us here in the region. But you're right. Iran, Qatar, Saudi changed theirs. Are they our examples though? And then we have, yes, Japanese culture is very heavily Americanized. Which culture is not? You tell me. Even in Britain, all of them, they're heavily Americanized. Because America is the cultural global power. They have Hollywood and people watch Hollywood movies, right? And most of our music come out of there. And so people are going to, to adopt that sort of fashion and things, American, So that is what we have to understand. And this is, as Z said, it's a cultural form of imperialism that has paralyzed the Caribbean, and it's essentially making us into slaves of U.S. culture. Culture is engineered. I don't know if it's engineered, because I think culture comes from the bottom. It's not the elites that create culture. They can't create culture because they're not really committed to our cultures, whether they're Trinidadians or Barbadians. They're committed to money. So I think it's more the ordinary people that create culture, but the elites capitalize on the creation of the culture that came from the bottom, right? And they exploit it. But culture never, because look at American culture. American culture is really Black culture, because it's what is sold to the world. And, nobody is as culturally, dynamic as the African American. I mean, they know how to produce culture, right? And they have, in that essence, they have dominated white America in terms of their, ability to create culture. They are second to none, right? The way how they talk, their music, and just the way how they behave. They're just naturally creators of culture. When you watch them, it's just amazing to watch them and the way how they interact. And you see culture, raw culture that can be sold anywhere in any Hollywood film. They're just naturally that way. It's amazing. It's amazing, but it's true. Who created carnivals? Wasn't that coming from Europe and Africa too? I think from Babylon, thereabout. Black culture was once hippie culture. Yes, yes, it is how the bourgeoisie, right? It's how the bourgeoisie control the proletariat. Absolutely, because we are the ones who create the culture, and then they weaponize it against us, and they gain money from doing so. Just like how they gain lots of money from African Americans, while they are the ones who created what is branded today as the American culture, that which whatever young people want to be like and to look like is really Black culture, or the image, the portrayal of the Black American culture. But are they benefiting from it? No, right? It's largely the few, yes, few of them are, the large majority aren't. The Black people created American culture, right? While white people monetize it. Absolutely. Well said. Well said. And that's what they do with everything, right? Just like we have our resources, whether you have bauxite or oil in Trinidad, what you have it there, you have the oil and gas in Trinidad, but who monetizes it? Right? Who is in control of it? The US, right? And that is what Venezuela was trying to do. Venezuela was trying to keep it for themselves. And the United States said, no, we should control it. And that was the big rift between Venezuela and the United States. It had nothing to do with who is democratic from who is undemocratic. It's just that the United States want to control everything. Your water, your beaches, your rivers, your oil, your minerals, everything, they want to control. And if they can't control it, they behave like children with a temper tantrum, and they will come and they will do whatever they have to get you out of power. So it's the same reality, people. It's the same reality. Nothing has changed. So why should we think that Africans were not involved in slavery? They were, because our Caribbean people are here enslaving us right now as we speak. We need more than ever before to build the best sense of self we can. If we fail, we are doomed. I think that we have failed because, as you're saying, the cultural imperialism. If we get our children off of these, these phones and and these music that they are singing and doing these things, maybe we can do that. But now our children are already brainwashed. And how do we unbrainwash them, right? I don't think that it's going to be possible at this time, because it's too ubiquitous. Everywhere they go, they see it, right? They don't even have to make an effort to listen to the music. It's everywhere. The cultural dynamic, the fashion, everything is just in your face. Right? So it's going to be a really tall order. You might have to go into a mountain and live by yourself, right? If you're going to escape these sort of cultural dynamics. Andrew, are we far gone for redemption? I thought that we weren't before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, then was when I thought that it might be too late. Okay, I think if we had stood up and fight against all of the things of the pandemic and all that they were trying to implement during that era, perhaps we could still do some fight. I think that we've gone too far. The books now, they're moving faster than they were moving before the pandemic, and it's going to be a lot. But we still should fight. I'm not, until we die, until we cannot give up hope. That's my philosophy. Even when things are dark, don't give up. Look at me. I'm still here on the lives, right? When I come here and I see like 20 people, 40 people, it's discouraging. But I'm not giving up. I'm still continuing, because maybe one day the algorithm will just have to, accept that I'm here and have to send the videos out. So yes, I don't think we should give up. I think we should still fight, even though it looks quite dark. If you're traumatized, easy to control. Well, aren't you traumatized during the pandemic? Weren't you traumatized? when they, told you couldn't go outside, you have to wear a mask and all these things. People were traumatized. I believe culture in the new world is predominantly African. And you're right. I want to think so, because when you see African American culture has permeated, and to some extent, and to a great extent, to Jamaican culture has permeated the nook and cranny of the world, and Caribbean culture too. So I think that, soca music is listened to in many, many countries. Pan music from Trinidad is listened to into many countries, right? So the Caribbean music / African American music, yes, I think that we have been excellent creators of culture, and hundreds of thousands of people go to Trinidad Carnival. Yes, so I agree 100% with you, Alexis. Absolutely true. Yeah, I agree with him. Yeah. So when we think out of the Caribbean and Americans, I think that we are second to none in terms of the creation of culture. But then again, African Americans are related to us in the Caribbean, because the ships stopped off first in the Caribbean, and then the slaves were dispersed to other parts of the world. So you have Barbados, Jamaica, and then you had the slaves were dispatched to other parts of the Americas. The YouTube algorithm suppresses YouTube channel because you discuss thought-provoking issues. Yes, and for whatever reason, sometimes you don't know what they do. Sometimes I see people discussing good topics too, and they do get their views. So maybe they contain some while they decide to suppress others. But let's see, and continue to. One of the things I want to do before we go, can you guys tell me what is the best time to have the live? Because you're not very consistent in when you come. You need to show up. And I want, what's the best time to have the live? We also have to understand that the algorithm works, yes, in a way in which if you are in and out, it's not going to say that your attention is limited. If you give the attention to the live, then it will send the live out to many people. So it's a two-way conversation, right? We have to be consistent. I'm trying to be consistent, but I want to have a consistent time. What time is best for you? I've tried 7 o'clock. You sometimes come, you sometimes don't come. I've tried 7 o'clock is better. Okay. I've tried 4 o'clock. Sometimes you come, sometimes you don't come. I've tried 5. So you tell me now in the line, and please be consistent. What time is the best time? These things o'clock, 7 p.m. What, anybody else? Let us have some other vote on the time. What time is best? The problem with 7 p.m. though, Z, that some people are having some people might be on other lives, and it might be like a split attention between both lives. That's what I'm trying to avoid to have a live when you don't have, it's not prime where you have other lives that you want to attend. Nothing is wrong with that. So we're trying not to have split lives where attention is split, because when you do that, then the algorithm is not going to. But 7 p.m. is good for me, but I'm asking for others, what time is the best time, and try to be consistent. If you are, the algorithm might decide to send the videos out to more people, right? So what time is it? Z saying 7 p.m. Any other person agrees with him or disagrees? What time for you? What time do you think is the best time to have our live conversations? Right. So we blame the algorithm for everything. We have to say that we too, as human beings, we contribute to what is happening, right? So, and that's the whole thing. We have to have the conversation is both ways. That how are we also not being, give me a specific time. What is the best time? 7, somebody's saying 7 or 8, WHZ saying 7 o'clock. Let's have, 10 more people saying 7 o'clock, then we'll choose 7. And stick with 7, and let us stick with 7 o'clock. If we decide 7 o'clock, let us stick with it. And so that, because the algorithm also needs to have a specific time where it says that this is when the person gets on the live, and they're expecting so many of us, and then they'll send the live, they push the live out. But when we are back and forth, and sometimes not, the algorithm gets confused. Right? And it might not treat the channel the same way it might treat people who have consistent followers and are going and are participating in the live. Excellent live, but we are not having the consistency that we need to have. to push the algorithm. Remember now that we also have to be agents. We can't stand wait on algorithm to change a thing. We can also be agents of change. That's what we are suggesting here. And we don't want to lay blame on one thing. We have to look at, from me to you, all of us have to look at our foibles and our weaknesses. Any other time, you're still looking at me, right? But again, you're going to tell me, oh, it's the algorithm, right? At the same time, you're also a part of the problem. So, yeah, so I don't know, you're not giving me enough, you're not responding. So I guess we just have to continue. Whenever you come, you come. And hopefully the algorithm will change its tune in the future to come. But it's sad, though, in the Caribbean that we are seeing things and people are not aware and they prefer to remain in ignorance. It's something that is very sad. Thank you so much for joining, and we will continue with another live topic on another day at another time, whenever I set the time for, because you're not giving me enough time where you would have committed yourself. So we'll talk. Have a great evening.